I stared at the empty oil stains on the concrete floor of my rented garage. My grandfather left me his beloved 1968 Mustang, the only piece of his legacy I ever cared about. Before the panic could even set in, my phone buzzed with a text from my younger sister. "I sold that rusty junk for $45,000. DeAndre and I needed the deposit for our Dubai wedding venue." Do not be dramatic. It was just sitting there. She had no idea that beneath the dashboard of that car was a secret that would obliterate her entire future. I am Claire, 33 years old, and I work as an architectural conservator. I spend my days identifying rot beneath beautiful facades. But the deepest rot I ever uncovered was in my own family. If you have ever had a toxic family member try to destroy your life for their own vanity, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe because you are going to want to see exactly how a $45,000 betrayal cost my sister a $25 million empire. I stood frozen in the dim light of the storage unit. The air still smelled faintly of motor oil and old leather, the signature scent of Grandfather Thomas. The space where the pristine vintage Ford Mustang had rested just yesterday was now nothing but a hollow void. My heart pounded against my ribs. I had been paying for this secure, climate-controlled unit for 3 years, ever since the reading of his will. While my parents and my sister fought viciously over his liquid assets and the estate, I only wanted the car. It was our project, our shared sanctuary away from the suffocating toxicity of my parents' house. I pulled out my phone to dial the facility manager, thinking it had been stolen by professionals. But the screen lit up with a message from Brittany. I read the words 3 times, my brain refusing to process the sheer audacity. I sold that rusty junk for $45,000. DeAndre and I needed the deposit for our Dubai wedding venue. Do not be dramatic. It was just sitting there. My 29-year-old sister had stolen my property. She had somehow bypassed the security, taken the car, and liquidated it to fund a luxury destination wedding. The sheer entitlement was suffocating, but it was not entirely surprising. Brittany was the golden child. She spent her days pretending to be an influencer, curating a fake life of luxury online, while my parents funded her every whim. I did not cry. I did not text her back. I threw my car into gear and drove straight to my parents' house in the upscale suburbs. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. For years, I had kept the peace. I had endured the subtle insults about my career. They called me a boring spinster who scraped mold off old bricks for a living. I had swallowed my pride to keep family harmony. But this was grand theft. This was the destruction of the only pure memory I had left of my grandfather. I bypassed the doorbell and shoved the heavy oak front door open with my shoulder. The scene in the living room looked like a staged photo shoot for a luxury lifestyle magazine. My mother Susan and my father Richard were sitting on the pristine white sofas. Across from them sat Brittany and her fiancé, DeAndre. DeAndre was a commercial real estate broker who wore flashy designer suits that screamed new money. They were all laughing, clinking expensive crystal flutes filled with champagne. The laughter died the second I stepped into the room. I marched directly up to the coffee table, ignoring the startled look on my mother's face. "Where is the car?" I demanded, my voice dangerously calm. I did not yell, I did not scream, I just wanted the answer. My mother sighed heavily, rolling her eyes and setting her champagne flute down on a coaster. "Claire, please, do not come storming in here, ruining a beautiful afternoon. Brittany just secured the venue at the Burj Al Arab. We are celebrating." I turned my gaze to Brittany. She was wearing a smug, defiant smirk, entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just committed a felony. "I asked you a question, Brittany. Where is my car?" DeAndre leaned back on the sofa, crossing his ankle over his knee. He swirled the champagne in his glass, and looked at me with absolute disdain. Look, Claire, you are killing the celebration vibe right now. The car was just gathering dust. Brittany put it to good use. We have a massive guest list of high-profile investors flying to Dubai. We needed the cash flow. You should be happy for your sister instead of acting like a psycho. Happy, I stared at him, marveling at the arrogance of this man who had barely been in our family for a year. You stole a vintage vehicle titled in my name. That is grand theft auto. I am giving you exactly 60 seconds to tell me who you sold it to before I call the police and have you both arrested. Instantly, Brittany's smug demeanor vanished, replaced by her favorite weapon, tears. She started sobbing loudly, burying her face in DeAndre's shoulder. Mom, tell her to stop, she wailed perfectly on cue. I am trying to plan the most important season of my life, and Claire is trying to ruin it because she is jealous. She has always been jealous of me. She wants to see me miserable. Susan rushed over to comfort her golden child, glaring at me as if I were the one who had committed a crime. You are being completely unreasonable, Claire. Your sister needs to project the right image for DeAndre's family. You sit in dusty old buildings all day. You do not understand how the real world works. The car is gone. Get over it. I stood my ground, my posture rigid as ice. I will not get over it. That car belongs to me, legally and morally. You have until the count of 3 to hand over the buyer's information, or my next call is to dispatch. 1, 2, 3, my father, interrupted his booming voice designed to rattle the walls, and my resolve. He stood up from his leather armchair, smoothing the front of his expensive golf polo. He always used his physical presence to intimidate, a tactic that worked well in boardrooms and even better on his daughters. But I was not a frightened child anymore. Put the phone away, Claire Richard commanded, stepping between me and DeAndre. You are acting completely unhinged. This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior we had to deal with when you were in college. Have you stopped taking your anxiety medications? The gaslighting was so practiced, so effortless. He brought up my college years as if I had been some wild, out-of-control problem child. The reality was entirely different. When I was 20, struggling to balance a full course load in architectural history with 2 part-time jobs, I had suffered a severe panic attack. My parents' response had not been to offer support. Instead, they completely cut off my tuition, claiming I was an unstable student who was wasting their hard-earned money. Meanwhile, they were actively funding Brittany's extravagant trips to Paris and Milan so she could build her pathetic social media following. My mental health is perfectly fine, Richard, I said deliberately, using his first name to strip away his parental authority. And my memory is flawless. I remember working night shifts to pay for my own textbooks while you bought Brittany a brand new convertible, so do not stand there and pretend you care about my stability. I want the buyer's information. Now. Susan scoffed loudly, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband. Listen to yourself, Claire. You are 33, single, and you spend your days scraping mold off old bricks. You have absolutely no concept of what is at stake here. She gestured dramatically toward DeAndre, who was now scrolling through his phone with an air of complete boredom. Brittany is marrying into a prominent family, Susan continued, her voice dripping with desperation for upper-class approval. DeAndre is a major player in commercial real estate. His clients are global investors. Brittany needs this Dubai wedding to secure his social standing. It is an investment in their future. What were you going to do with that old car anyway? Let it rot in a storage unit while you live your boring, lonely life. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the air. For a fraction of a second, the old childhood wounds flared up. The constant comparisons, the relentless message that I was the inadequate, boring sister, while Brittany was the shining star destined for greatness. But the pain quickly hardened into pure glacial anger. They had justified stealing from me because they fundamentally believed my life had less value than Brittany's vanity. My career in architectural conservation preserves history, I replied, my voice dangerously even. And my single status means I do not have to rely on a man's social standing to validate my existence. But none of that matters. You can try to justify it however you want, Susan. The fact remains that your golden child committed a severe crime. Grand theft auto is a felony in this state, and I will press charges. Brittany whimpered again, clutching DeAndre's arm tighter. Babe, tell her to stop. She is trying to ruin everything. I just wanted our wedding to be perfect. She is being so toxic. DeAndre finally looked up from his phone. He let out a deep, arrogant chuckle that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. He stood up, towering over me in his custom-tailored suit, reeking of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. He walked slowly toward me, trying to use his height to force me to step back. I held my ground. A felony, DeAndre sneered, shaking his head slowly. Look at you playing lawyer. You really think the police are going to care about some dusty old Ford? It is a civil family dispute over shared property. The cops will laugh you out of the precinct. They deal with real crimes, not sisters squabbling over garage junk. Besides, the deal is done. The money is wired to the event coordinators in Dubai. The car is gone, Claire. You are fighting a war you already lost. Accept it and move on. I met his arrogant gaze without blinking. The car was titled exclusively in my name, DeAndre. There is no shared property. It does not matter if the money is in Dubai or sitting on this coffee table. Without my signature on the title transfer, the sale is completely fraudulent. The buyer is in possession of stolen property, and the person who sold it committed fraud. So yes, the police will care very much. They tend to care when a vehicle worth tens of thousands of dollars is fenced illegally. DeAndre laughed again, a harsh, dismissive sound. He clearly believed that his status and his aggressive posturing would force me to back down. He was accustomed to bullying his way through real estate deals, intimidating smaller buyers into submission. He thought I was just another weak opponent he could steamroll. You are bluffing, DeAndre challenged, stepping directly into my personal space. You are not going to call the cops on your own sister and humiliate your parents. You do not have the spine for it. You are just throwing a tantrum because you are jealous she is getting married and you are alone. I held my phone up, my thumb hovering directly over the emergency call button. I did not break eye contact with him. Try me. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The smug confidence on DeAndre's face cracked just a fraction. He looked at Richard silently, demanding that the patriarch of the family handle this problem. Richard's face had turned a deep, angry shade of red. He realized I was not yielding to the usual emotional blackmail. He realized I was fully prepared to watch my sister get arrested in her designer clothes and watch their precious reputation burn to the ground. Richard moved to his leather briefcase resting on the mahogany side table. You want to talk about the law, Claire? He growled, snapping the brass latches open with violent force. Let us talk about the law. You think you are so smart. You think you have us backed into a corner. He pulled out a crisp white manila folder and slammed it down onto the glass coffee table with a resounding smack. You are not calling anyone, Richard stated, his voice laced with absolute chilling certainty, because you legally sold that car to Brittany 3 days ago. I stared at the manila folder resting on the glass surface. The utter confidence in my father's voice sent a sudden sharp warning down my spine. I stepped forward and flipped the folder open. Inside sat 2 crisp pieces of paper. The first was a bill of sale for the 1968 Ford Mustang, listing the purchase price as $45,000. The buyer was listed as Brittany. The seller was listed as me. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in blue ink, was a perfect replica of my signature. Beneath that was the second document, a limited power of attorney, granting Brittany the right to manage and liquidate the vehicle on my behalf. and there, stamped at the bottom of both documents, was the official raised seal of a notary public, Richard's official seal. He had signed as the witnessing notary. My eyes darted from the forged ink to the man standing across the coffee table. "You forged my signature," I stated, my voice dangerously flat. "And you used your corporate notary license to authenticate a federal crime." Richard did not flinch. He adjusted his watch, looking entirely unbothered. I merely facilitated a transaction that was in the best interest of this family. Your grandfather intended for that asset to benefit us all. Brittany needed the funds, and as the patriarch of this family, I made sure the wealth was distributed correctly. I notarized a document confirming you gifted the car to your sister. If you try to tell the police otherwise, it will be your word against a respected corporate executive, your mother, your sister, and a prominent real estate broker who all stand ready to testify that you signed those papers willingly in this very room. DeAndre crossed his arms, leaning back into the sofa cushions. 2 against 1, Claire. Actually, 4 against 1. You walked in here screaming and threatening us. Who do you think the police will believe? The hysterical single sister with a documented history of panic attacks? Or 4 upstanding citizens? The sheer scale of their conspiracy hit me like a physical blow. They had not just acted out of desperation or momentary greed. They had sat down, planned this forged legal documents, and weaponized my father's professional credentials to steal from me. They had built an entire fortress of lies to protect Brittany's vanity project. "You are insane," I said, looking at the 4 of them. "You are willing to risk your career, your freedom, and your license, Richard, just to pay for a wedding venue?" Richard stepped closer, entirely dropping the pretense of the concerned father. "Let us get one thing absolutely clear, Claire. You are not going to the police. You are not going to hire a lawyer. You are going to walk out that door, go back to your miserable little apartment, and keep your mouth shut. Because if you breathe a single word of this to anyone, if you cause even a ripple of scandal before Brittany walks down the aisle in Dubai, I will utterly destroy you." I held my ground. "You cannot destroy me. You have no power over my life anymore." He let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Do not be naive. I know exactly how fragile your architectural conservation firm is. You are a small business owner, relying on historic preservation grants and private, wealthy clients. Clients who happen to run in my social circles. If you file a police report, I will immediately file a countersuit for defamation. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the next decade. I will bury you in legal fees so deep, you will have to sell your business just to pay your retainers." Susan nodded, eagerly stepping up beside him. "Your father is right. We will tell everyone in our network that you are having another mental breakdown. We will tell your clients that you are suing your own family out of bitter jealousy. Who will hire an unstable conservator to manage million-dollar historic properties? Your reputation in this city will be ash by the end of the week." Brittany smiled, wiping away her fake tears. "Just let it go, Claire. It is just a car. I am getting married. This is my time to shine. Do not ruin your own life just because you are mad that I am getting everything you never had." DeAndre pointed a finger at me. "You heard them. Walk away. Play nice, and maybe we will send you a postcard from the Burj Al Arab." I looked at the forged documents on the table. I looked at the notary stamp that gave their theft the illusion of legality. I realized then that my father was right about one thing. If I called the police right now, it would be a messy, drawn-out battle. They would use their wealth, their connections, and their combined testimonies to drag my name through the mud. They would frame it as a civil dispute, a simple family misunderstanding over an inheritance. The police might even decline to arrest them without a lengthy investigation, giving DeAndre exactly what he wanted: time. I realized that reacting with anger was exactly what they expected. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to throw a tantrum. They wanted me to validate their narrative that I was the unstable, dramatic sister. So I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not utter a single word of protest. I let a dead, cold silence stretch across the living room. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were hard and calculating. I looked at my sister, whose face was painted with superficial triumph. I looked at DeAndre, who radiated unearned arrogance. And finally, I looked at Richard, the man who had traded his daughter for a facade of social elite status. I memorized their smug faces. I committed every detail of their triumphant smirks to memory. I wanted to remember exactly how confident they felt in this moment, so I could savor the exact opposite expression on their faces when I tore their lives apart. The conflict had shifted. This was no longer a family dispute over a stolen classic car. This was a high-stakes war for my survival, my dignity, and my grandfather's true legacy. They thought they had trapped me in a legal corner. They thought their forged paperwork and corporate connections made them untouchable. They had no idea I was about to unleash a firestorm they could not control. Without saying a single word, I turned on my heel and walked out the front door. I heard DeAndre laugh behind me, assuming my silence was a surrender. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, pulled my phone from my pocket, and walked toward my car. The familial bond was officially dead, and the gloves were off. I slid into the driver's seat of my car and slammed the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet, leather-lined interior. The silence was deafening after the screaming match inside my parents' house. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, but the physical pain grounded me. The feeling of absolute betrayal washed over me in heavy, suffocating waves. They had not just stolen a piece of metal, they had stolen the last tangible piece of Grandfather Thomas, and they had done it with a sickening level of premeditation. My father, a man who built his entire reputation on corporate integrity, had literally forged a legal document to rob his own daughter. My mother had cheered him on. My sister had funded her vanity project with the proceeds. And DeAndre had stood there mocking me. I stared blankly through the windshield at the immaculate landscaping of my childhood home. I began contemplating a massive legal war. I knew Richard was not bluffing about his corporate connections. If I went straight to the police, he would deploy his high-priced attorneys before the ink on my statement was even dry. He would file injunctions, tie up the police investigation with fabricated evidence, and launch a smear campaign against my architectural conservation firm. In the world of historic preservation, reputation was everything. If influential clients believed I was mentally unstable and suing my family out of spite, my business would collapse within a month. Richard knew exactly where to strike. I needed a strategy that bypassed the local police precinct. I needed leverage that their money and influence could not crush. I needed a weapon. I reached for the ignition, my mind racing through lists of federal fraud investigators and private attorneys who operated outside my father's sphere of influence. The sheer scale of their arrogance was staggering. They honestly believed I would just roll over and accept this theft because they had spent my entire life conditioning me to be the quiet, compliant daughter. They thought my passion for preserving old buildings made me weak and averse to conflict. They were wrong. Preserving history meant knowing exactly how to strip away layers of grime and expose the ugly truth underneath. I was ready to tear their entire social facade to the ground, brick by brick. Just as my fingers brushed the push-to-start button, my cell phone erupted with a loud, jarring ringtone. I glanced down at the center console. The caller ID flashed a name I had not seen on my screen in over a year. It was Hector. Hector owned a highly respected classic car restoration shop across town. He was a master mechanic, a purist who treated vintage vehicles with a level of reverence most people reserve for religion. More importantly, he was the only mechanic Grandfather Thomas had ever allowed to touch the 1968 Ford Mustang. Hector knew every bolt, every wire, and every custom modification on that vehicle. Why was he calling me now, just hours after my sister had illegally fenced the car? A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my chest. I snatched the phone from the console and answered. "Hector," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Claire." "Hector," said his voice, completely stripping away his usual calm demeanor. He sounded frantic, breathless, like he had just sprinted across his shop floor. "You need to get down here right now. Drop whatever you are doing and get to the shop." I sat up perfectly straight, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hector, what is going on?" I asked, the tension in my voice rising. "A guy just brought your Mustang in," Hector replied rapidly. "He wanted a premium top-to-bottom detailing job. Said he just bought it and needed it looking showroom ready by tomorrow. I knew that car the second I saw it pull into the lot, Claire. I know the custom mix on that cherry red paint. I know the exhaust note. I asked him where he got it, and he handed me the keys, acting like he owned the world. I took it straight to the secure bay in the back." My grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing creaked. "Is the car still there?" I demanded. "Is it safe?" "It is locked in my private bay," Hector confirmed, his breathing still heavy. "But that is not why I am calling. When my guys started doing the deep interior clean, they had to pull off the original dashboard panel to get behind the gauges. The brackets felt wrong, heavier than they should be. When we pulled the panel completely off, we found a custom welded steel box bolted directly into the firewall. I felt the air leave my lungs. "A steel box," I echoed. Grandfather Thomas had never mentioned any modifications to the firewall. Hector lowered his voice, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. "We managed to pop the latch. Claire, your grandfather hid something inside the car. You will not believe this. I need you to come see this with your own eyes before this buyer comes back demanding his keys." I did not ask any more questions. I did not need to. "Lock the bay doors, Hector," I commanded, my voice sharp and decisive. "Do not let anyone near that vehicle, and if the buyer returns, stall him. I do not care what you have to say to him. Tell him the engine needs to cool. Tell him you found a dangerous leak. Just keep the keys out of his hands. I am on my way." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The crushing despair from just moments ago completely vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp electric focus. Grandfather Thomas had always been a man of secrets and contingency plans. He knew his son was greedy. He knew my mother was vain. And he knew exactly what he was doing when he left that specific car entirely to me. He had not just left me a classic vehicle. He had left me a puzzle, and my sister had just accidentally handed it over to a stranger. I slammed the car into gear, the tires screeching against the pristine asphalt of my parents' driveway. The heavy engine roared to life as I accelerated down the suburban street, tearing away from the house of lies. I sped across town toward the restoration shop, navigating the afternoon traffic with a singular burning purpose. The game had just changed. I pulled into the gravel lot of Hector's Restoration and Performance, my tires kicking up a cloud of white dust. The industrial park was a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of my parents' suburban fortress, but right now, it felt like the safest place on earth. I parked near the back alley, killed the engine, and rushed toward the heavy corrugated metal doors of the private bay. Hector was waiting. The second I stepped inside, he hauled the heavy steel door shut and threw the deadbolt, plunging the bay into a mix of harsh fluorescent light and deep shadows. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil degreaser and premium carnauba wax. Sitting proudly on the center hydraulic lift was my grandfather's 1968 Ford Mustang. The cherry red paint gleamed under the overhead shop lights, looking immaculate, completely untouched by the betrayal it had just been through. Hector wiped his grease-stained hands on a shop rag, his expression grave. He was a man of few words, a master mechanic who usually let his restoration work speak for him. But today, his eyes were wide with a frantic, uncharacteristic energy. I told the buyer we found a hairline fracture in the fuel line, Hector said, leading me under the raised chassis of the Mustang. I told him it was a massive fire hazard, and I needed at least 6 hours to source a vintage replacement part. The guy was furious, but he left. He said he would be back with a tow truck if I did not have it ready by closing. "Thank you, Hector," I breathed, my eyes fixed on the undercarriage of the car. "Show me what you found." Hector grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and pointed the beam upward, illuminating the dark cavity directly behind the dashboard console. When we pulled the original radio unit to detail the wiring harness, I noticed the firewall backing was not factory standard. The weight distribution was wrong. Your grandfather had someone install a false plate right behind the gauge cluster. He walked over to his red metal tool cabinet and retrieved a heavy rectangular steel box. It looked like a miniature vault, scarred with custom weld marks that perfectly matched the curvature of the Mustang's internal framing. It was an engineering marvel, designed to be completely invisible to anyone who did not tear the car down to its bare chassis. I managed to pop the latch using a precision drill, Hector explained, setting the heavy steel box down on a nearby workbench. "I did not touch what was inside. That is your business, Claire." I stepped up to the workbench. My hands were remarkably steady as I reached out and lifted the heavy steel lid. Inside the velvet-lined compartment rested 2 items. The first was a weathered, leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked and soft from age bearing the embossed initials of Grandfather Thomas. Beneath the journal lay a thick, heavy manila envelope, secured with a crimson wax seal. I picked up the journal first. The pages were filled with my grandfather's sharp, precise handwriting. I flipped to a dog-eared page near the middle of the book. The entry was dated exactly 4 months before he suffered his fatal stroke. I read the ink on the page, and the true depth of my grandfather's foresight hit me like a physical strike. He had known everything. Thomas wrote meticulously about how he had caught Richard and Susan embezzling funds from his primary holding company. He documented their greed, their vanity, and their utter lack of business ethics. He knew that the moment he died, they would descend like vultures, tearing his estate apart to fund their lavish, empty lifestyles. He knew they would cast me aside because I refused to play their toxic social games. I am liquidating the core assets my grandfather had written. I am pulling the foundation out from under them before they can squander it. They only value what shines. They only respect what they can flaunt. They will fight over the houses and the bank accounts, but they will never look twice at an old car. I am leaving the true legacy to Claire. She is the only one who understands that real value requires preservation. I set the journal down, my throat tight with emotion. My grandfather had not just left me a classic car. He had built a fortress to protect me from my own parents. He had weaponized their superficiality against them. Because they viewed the Mustang as a rusty, boring hobby, they had completely ignored the greatest asset in the entire estate. I reached into the steel box and pulled out the heavy manila envelope. The crimson wax seal bore the crest of a high-powered Texas law firm. I snapped the brittle wax ope, pulled the flap open, and slid a thick stack of legal documents onto the workbench. It was a deed of trust. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my architectural and business training kicking in. It was an irrevocable blind trust established over 2 decades ago. The designated sole beneficiary was me, Claire. My parents had absolutely zero legal claim, zero oversight, and zero access to the trust. But it was the property description attached to the deed that made my breath catch in my lungs. The trust held exclusive, unencumbered ownership of a massive, contiguous plot of commercial real estate located squarely in downtown Austin, Texas. It included the original land deeds, zoning permits for high-density commercial development, and full mineral rights. Hector leaned over, looking at the bold print detailing the property coordinates. His eyes widened in absolute shock. "Claire," he breathed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "My brother works in commercial development down in Texas. That address is right in the heart of the new tech corridor. Developers have been fighting a bloody war over every square inch of that district for the last 5 years." I stared at the paperwork, my mind rapidly running the calculations. I knew the commercial real estate market. I knew the zoning laws in that specific sector of Austin. A contiguous, undeveloped plot of that magnitude fully permitted for commercial high-rises was incredibly rare. "Hector," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "what is the current market valuation for a plot this size in that district?" Hector shook his head, staring at the deed as if it were glowing. "With full commercial zoning, upwards of $25 million, easily. Maybe more if a major tech conglomerate gets into a bidding war over the site. $25 million. The number echoed in the quiet, grease-scented garage. I looked at the 1968 Mustang sitting on the lift, and then I looked back at the legal documents resting on the workbench. The sheer, magnificent irony of the situation struck me with the force of a freight train. My golden child sister Brittany had been so desperate to fund a lavish, superficial wedding in Dubai. She had been so eager to impress a broke, flashy real estate broker. She had been so arrogant, so utterly dismissive of my worth that she had stolen my property to pay for her vanity project. She had forged my signature and committed a federal crime to sell the Mustang to a stranger for $45,000. She had absolutely no idea that she had just sold a $25 million golden ticket for the price of scrap metal. She had handed away generational wealth for the price of a single venue deposit. Grandfather Thomas had set the ultimate trap, and my toxic family had walked right into it, blinded by their own greed. The deed was legally designated strictly to me. Without my authenticated in-person signature, the trust could not be executed, and the land could not be sold or developed. The stranger who bought the car possessed the physical paper, but it was entirely worthless without me. My parents and my sister thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had left me with nothing. Instead, they had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy their entire fake empire. I carefully folded the deed and placed it back into the manila envelope, sliding it alongside the leather journal into my leather tote bag. The game had not just changed. I had already won. I just needed to execute the final move. I opened the weathered leather journal again, running my fingers over the pages where my grandfather had detailed the ultimate betrayal. He had not just suspected my parents of greed. He had absolute proof. According to the meticulous ledgers he kept in the back of the journal, Richard and Susan had been quietly siphoning funds from his primary construction business for over a decade. They had used his company accounts as their personal piggy bank to fund luxury country club memberships, extravagant European vacations, and Brittany's endless designer wardrobe. The sheer entitlement made my stomach churn. My father, the man who constantly lectured me about hard work and fiscal responsibility, was nothing but a glorified thief wearing a bespoke suit. My mother, who looked down her nose at my modest apartment, had built her entire socialite persona on stolen money. My grandfather had watched them drain his life's work. Instead of confronting them and triggering a messy legal battle that would have torn the family apart while he was still alive, Thomas chose a much colder, more brilliant form of retaliation. He systematically and secretly liquidated his remaining private assets. He cashed out offshore accounts, sold international holdings, and pulled every single clean dollar he had left to purchase that massive commercial plot in Austin. Then he locked the deed inside the Mustang and left the car solely to me. It was his final, silent judgment. He knew my parents would tear through his bank accounts like starving wolves, completely ignoring the old car sitting in the garage. He punished their superficial greed by hiding his true empire in plain sight. The weight of what I held in my hands was staggering. Brittany had complained about the Mustang being an eyesore. She had literally called it rusty junk while justifying her felony to fund a superficial Dubai wedding. She thought she had pulled off the ultimate heist. She thought she had humiliated me and secured her flawless influencer aesthetic all in one swift move. I pictured her smug face back at my parents' house, sipping champagne with DeAndre, completely oblivious to the reality of what she had done. She did not just steal a classic car. She unwittingly fenced a $25 million golden ticket for $45,000. She gave away generational wealth for the price of a mid-tier catering deposit. The irony was so sharp it almost burned. They had broken into my life, violated my grandfather's memory, and committed grand theft auto, all to accidentally hand away a fortune that could have secured their entire bloodline. I could only imagine how smug Brittany must have felt taking that $45,000 from the buyer, convinced she had outsmarted everyone. And the best part was the legal trap Thomas had constructed. The deed was utterly useless to anyone without my authenticated in-person signature to execute the blind trust. The physical paper was just paper until I validated it. My sister had sold a locked treasure chest, and I was the only living key. Before I could fully process the tactical advantage I now possessed, the heavy sound of gravel crunching outside the garage broke the silence. Hector stiffened his grease-stained hands instinctively, reaching for a heavy steel wrench on his workbench. A low, menacing hum of a high-performance engine vibrated through the metal walls of the shop. I quickly shoved the deed and the journal deep into my leather tote bag and zipped it shut securely. I moved toward the small reinforced window set into the heavy bay door and peered out into the fading afternoon light. A sleek midnight black luxury vehicle had just pulled into the lot, parking diagonally to aggressively block the main exit. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out into the dusty industrial yard. He did not look like a typical mechanic or a casual car enthusiast. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit that easily cost more than Hector's entire shop. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair slicked back and a posture that radiated absolute, ruthless authority. "That is him," Hector whispered, stepping up right behind me. "That is the guy who bought your Mustang from your sister." I watched the man adjust his cuffs before walking toward the closed bay doors with terrifying confidence. This was not just a guy looking for a joyride. This was Harrison, a notorious billionaire and one of the most ruthless classic car collectors in the country. I had read about him in architectural and historic preservation circles. He was known for acquiring rare assets through aggressive, often predatory tactics. He did not buy cars to drive them. He bought them to possess the history they represented. And he possessed the capital to crush anyone who stood in his way. Harrison did not knock politely. He slammed his fist against the corrugated metal door, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the quiet garage. "I know you are in there!" Hector Harrison's voice boomed from the other side of the steel barrier. The tone was cultured, but laced with absolute menace. "Open this door immediately. You told me you needed to source a vintage fuel line, but I just ran a background check on your supplier network. You have not placed a single order today. I want my property, and I want it now." Hector looked at me, panic flashing in his dark eyes. He gripped the heavy wrench tighter, his knuckles turning white. "What do we do, Claire? This guy has enough money to buy the entire police department. If he realizes we pulled the dashboard apart and found the safe, he is going to tear this place to the ground." I adjusted the strap of my tote bag on my shoulder, feeling the heavy, solid weight of the $25 million deed resting against my hip. I did not feel fear. I felt the thrill of a high-stakes collision. Harrison thought he was dealing with a simple mechanic and a naive influencer who sold him a car. He had no idea he was about to face the true legal owner of the prize he was hunting. "Open the door, Hector," I said, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "Let him in. I think it is time the billionaire and I had a conversation about stolen property." Hector swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly, but he reached out and pressed the heavy green button on the concrete wall. The industrial motor groaned to life. The corrugated metal door began to grind upward, pouring harsh, blinding afternoon sunlight into the dim, oil-scented bay. Harrison did not wait for the door to fully open. He ducked his tall frame under the rising metal barricade and stepped inside, his expensive Italian leather shoes crunching softly against the grit of the concrete floor. He ignored Hector completely, acting as if the master mechanic did not even exist. His piercing silver eyes swept the room, immediately dismissing the pristine 1968 Mustang on the lift before locking directly onto me. A slow, highly calculated smile spread across his weathered face. "Claire," he said smoothly, taking a moment to adjust the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. "I was wondering how long it would take you to catch up. I see you found the vault." I did not flinch. I stood my ground, my hand resting firmly on the leather strap of my tote bag, where the deed and the journal were hidden. "You bought a stolen vehicle, Mr. Harrison," I stated, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "My sister committed a felony by forging my signature on the bill of sale. That makes you an accessory to Grand Theft Auto." Harrison let out a dry, harsh laugh that held absolutely no genuine amusement. It sounded more like a threat, disguised as a chuckle. "Let us drop the amateur legal posturing, Claire. We both know I do not care a single bit about this rusty piece of Detroit steel." He waved a dismissive manicured hand toward the cherry-red Mustang. "I did not pay your foolish sister $45,000 for a vintage paint job or a rebuilt engine block. I paid for what your grandfather bolted behind the dashboard." He took a slow, deliberate step closer, exuding an aura of absolute corporate dominance that was designed to make smaller people shrink away. I did not move an inch. "Thomas was a brilliant man," Harrison continued, his voice dropping into a lecturing tone. "A paranoid, vindictive, stubborn genius, but brilliant nonetheless. When he started quietly liquidating his core assets years ago, my acquisition firm was watching closely. We knew he purchased that prime commercial acreage in downtown Austin. We also knew he established a highly secure blind trust to hide it from your greedy, incompetent parents. But the stubborn old fool died before I could make him a formal offer to acquire the plot." Harrison began pacing the length of the garage bay, his sharp eyes never leaving mine, tracking my reactions. I spent the last 2 years paying top-tier private investigators exorbitant fees to trace his final financial movements. It took them a frustrating amount of time to realize the deed was not sitting in a bank vault or a hidden safety deposit box. He locked it inside the only asset he explicitly willed to you: this car. He stopped pacing and turned to face me squarely, dropping all pretense of casual conversation. "That land in Austin is the exact footprint my development company needs for a massive, multi-billion-dollar tech campus. It is the final non-negotiable puzzle piece for a project that will completely redefine the entire city grid. I need that deed, Claire, and I am not a man who accepts delays." Harrison reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook. With his other hand, he produced a heavy gold fountain pen. "I know your exact situation. I ran a full financial and background check on you the moment my proxy buyer secured this car from your desperate, status-obsessed sister. You run a boutique architectural conservation firm. You scrape by on historic grants and minor private contracts. You live in a modest apartment. You drive a sensible sedan. I am prepared to make your life incredibly easy right now." He clicked the cap off the pen. "I will write you a cashier's check for $1 million tax-free right here on the hood of this car. All you have to do is reach into that bag, hand me the deed of trust, and sign a standard relinquishment of your beneficiary rights. You walk out of this garage a millionaire. You take your little hobby car back, and we pretend this transaction never happened. $1 million clears a lot of problems for a small business owner, Claire." I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the man who truly believed his immense wealth made him an undisputed god among working-class mortals. Then I looked him dead in the eye and smiled. $1 million, I said, letting the words roll off my tongue with heavy, biting sarcasm. "That is a very generous offer for a piece of commercial real estate, fully zoned for high-density tech development in the fastest-growing commercial corridor of Austin. A plot that, according to the current market data, is valued at a minimum of $25 million. Harrison's hand froze mid-air. The confident, predatory smirk dropped from his face entirely, replaced by a flash of genuine shock. I stepped toward him, closing the distance, refusing to let him hold the high ground. "You are not offering me $1 million out of generosity, Mr. Harrison. You are offering it out of sheer desperation. Because your highly paid private investigators might have tracked down the car, and your proxy buyer might have secured the physical paper from my idiot sister, but you missed one crucial, monumental detail about how my grandfather structured his blind trusts." I patted the side of my leather tote bag. "The physical deed is completely worthless without my legally authenticated in-person signature to execute the transfer. I am the sole legally designated beneficiary. You cannot bulldoze a single square foot of that Austin land without my explicit notarized authorization. My sister accidentally gave you the locked safe, but I am the only living key. So you can put your checkbook away. The price just went up, and I do not take lowball offers from men who buy stolen property." Harrison's eyes narrowed into dangerous, icy slits. The air in the garage grew thick with suffocating tension. He opened his mouth, clearly preparing to unleash a torrent of corporate threats that would make my father's previous blackmail look like child's play. He was calculating exactly how to break me. But before a single threatening word could escape his lips, the sharp, piercing ringtone of my cell phone shattered the dead silence in the garage. I broke eye contact with the billionaire and pulled the phone from my bag. The screen flashed with my sister's name. I hit answer and brought the speaker to my ear. Immediately, Brittany's hysterical, blood-curdling screams blasted through the audio, so loud and unhinged that even Harrison took a startled step back. "Claire! Claire, answer me right now!" Brittany shrieked. The sheer panic in her voice bordered on a complete psychiatric meltdown. The sound was so jarring, so completely devoid of her usual polished influencer persona, that it echoed off the metal walls of the garage like a siren. I pulled the phone away from my ear, maintaining unbroken eye contact with Harrison. The billionaire took a startled step back, but his surprise quickly morphed into sharp, predatory curiosity. He recognized the sound of a collapsing empire. I tapped the speaker button on my screen, holding the device up so Harrison could hear every single word of my family's rapid destruction. "I am here, Brittany," I said, keeping my voice completely steady, an anchor against her rising hysteria. "What is wrong? Are you not celebrating your perfect Dubai wedding with the champagne Mom poured?" "Shut up about the wedding!" she screamed, her breath hitching in ragged, frantic gasps. "DeAndre's losing his mind. He is throwing things. He just smashed his expensive laptop against the wall. Claire, you have to help us. You have to tell us exactly what was in that car." I glanced at Harrison. He raised a single silver eyebrow, completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. "What makes you think there was anything in that car, Brittany?" I asked, deliberately baiting the trap, letting her confess her own ruin. "Because DeAndre's broker just called him," Brittany wailed. The audio distorted slightly from how hard she was crying. "DeAndre's firm is in trouble, Claire. Like, serious, catastrophic trouble. He has major investors threatening to pull their funding and call the federal authorities. His entire company is leveraged to the brink on this one massive development deal they have been trying to close for over a year. A huge commercial plot in downtown Austin. It was supposed to save everything. It was supposed to make his firm hundreds of millions in profit. She paused to gulp down air, sobbing loudly into the receiver. His broker finally managed to unmask the anonymous owner of the land. It is Grandfather Thomas. It is a blind trust set up by Thomas and DeAndre. Just realized he sat there and watched me sell the only vehicle Thomas explicitly willed to you. I listened to the raw, unfiltered desperation pouring from the speaker. The polished, wealthy facade DeAndre had paraded in my parents' living room just hours ago was nothing but smoke and mirrors. He was a desperate man, standing on the very edge of financial ruin, and Brittany, my superficial, status-obsessed sister, was tied to a sinking ship. She went on to explain how DeAndre had aggressively questioned the broker, demanding to know where the physical deed might be located. When the broker mentioned that eccentric older billionaires often hid bearer bonds or deeds in physical assets, the horrifying reality had struck DeAndre like a physical blow. He had just sat on my parents' pristine white sofa, mocking me while I fought for the very car that held his only salvation. DeAndre knows the deed was in the car, Brittany screeched, her voice cracking under the intense, crushing strain. He tracked the buyer down through the dealership records. He knows some billionaire named Harrison bought it through a proxy. Do you have the paperwork? Claire, tell me you took it out before the buyer drove off. Give it to us right now. The puzzle pieces snapped together with absolute brutal clarity. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. DeAndre was not a titan of commercial real estate. He was an over-leveraged fraud, drowning in massive debt. His expensive custom suits, the flashy lifestyle, the ridiculous Dubai wedding, all of it was a desperate gamble to project success while he scrambled to find a way to avoid bankruptcy and federal prison. The Austin land was his only remaining lifeline. If he could have secured it, he could have used it as collateral to appease his furious investors. Instead, he had laughed in my face while his fiancée sold his literal salvation to a stranger for pocket change. The irony was thick and satisfying. For my entire life, my parents had measured human worth by financial status. They had worshipped DeAndre because he projected the exact image of wealth they craved. They had allowed him to disrespect me in their own home, treating me like a second-class citizen because my architectural conservation firm was not flashy enough for their tastes. Now the truth was out. The man they had essentially sold their souls to impress was nothing but a hollow shell, a desperate con artist, playing a high-stakes game with other people's money. They realized the catastrophic, monumental mistake they had made. They had given away the keys to a $25 million kingdom just to spite me. Claire, please, Brittany begged, completely abandoning her usual arrogance. Mom is having a panic attack on the floor. DeAndre says if we do not get that deed, he is going to prison for defrauding his investors. He will cancel the wedding. My life will be over. You have to save us. Give us the deed. I stared at the phone in my hand. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons, and the blatant theft they had committed just hours ago. I looked back up at Harrison, who was now smiling a grim, terrifying smile. He knew he had them cornered, too. You sold the car, Brittany, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. You forged my signature and took the money. You made your bed, now lie in it. Claire, do not, you dare hang up on me. I ended the call. The silence rushed back into the garage bay, heavy and charged with static electricity. I turned off the phone and slid it back into my tote bag. Harrison stepped forward, clapping his hands together slowly in a mocking, rhythmic applause. Well played, Claire. It seems your sister just handed me the exact leverage I need. DeAndre owes my holding company a significant amount of money. If his firm goes under, I seize his remaining assets. But if I have that deed, I control the entire board. We can still make a deal right now. Name your price." Harrison watched me with a newfound respect. The predatory glint in his eye had not faded, but it had shifted. He was no longer looking at a desperate girl he could easily buy off. He was looking at a formidable opponent, holding the very asset he needed to complete his own corporate empire. He knew I had the upper hand, and he knew that my family's sudden panic only increased the value of the document resting safely inside my leather tote bag. I shook my head, gripping my bag tightly against my side. I am not making a deal in a dusty garage with a man who buys stolen goods. I turned to Hector, who was staring at me with a mixture of shock and profound respect. "Keep the car locked down, Hector. Do not let anyone touch it." I walked past the billionaire without giving him another glance. The battle had escalated beyond a simple transaction. My family was desperate, cornered, and facing total ruin. I knew exactly what they would do next. They would come for me. I needed to get back to my apartment and prepare for a siege. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles stark white against the leather, as I navigated the evening traffic back to my apartment. The heavy leather tote bag sat on the passenger seat, the zipper securely fastened over my grandfather's journal and the $25 million deed. Harrison's predatory smile burned in my mind, but a much more immediate threat occupied my thoughts. My family was desperate. Desperation breeds recklessness, and my father had already proven he was willing to commit a felony by forging my signature. I needed to secure my apartment, gather my essential documents, and relocate to a secure hotel until I could bring this war to a public, inescapable conclusion. I pulled into my designated parking spot beneath my building. The quiet, familiar surroundings of my modest complex usually brought me a sense of peace. Today, the shadows felt hostile. I slung the heavy tote bag firmly over my shoulder, keeping my hand pressed securely against the side where the manila envelope rested. I bypassed the elevator and took the stairs, my heart pounding, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat in my chest. When I reached the third-floor landing, my breath hitched. Unreliable, the heavy wooden door to my apartment was violently ajar. Splinters of painted wood and twisted metal from the deadbolt littered the hallway carpet. Someone had literally kicked the door off its hinges. The sound of tearing fabric, shattering glass, and frantic, muffled shouting spilled out from my living room. I did not freeze. The icy resolve that had crystallized in Hector's garage flooded my veins. I stepped silently through the broken doorway, the heavy tote bag pressed tightly against my side. My sanctuary had been utterly destroyed. The drafting tables, where I meticulously restored centuries-old blueprints, were overturned. My architectural reference books were swept onto the floor, their spines broken. The cushions of my sofa had been slashed open, white stuffing scattered across the hard wood like dirty snow. And in the center of this absolute devastation were the 4 people who claimed to be my family. Susan was frantically ripping through my filing cabinets, throwing tax returns and client contracts over her shoulder. Richard was physically tearing the backing off framed photographs, desperately hunting for a hidden wall safe. Brittany was on her knees in my bedroom, hurling my clothes out of the closet in a frantic, unhinged frenzy. And DeAndre was standing in the center of my ruined living room, his flashy suit jacket discarded, sweat pouring down his face as he barked orders at my father. "Check the floorboards!" DeAndre yelled, his voice cracking with pure, feral panic. "The broker said Thomas set the trust up 20 years ago. She has to have the physical paperwork. Tear the baseboards up if you have to. We are not leaving without that deed." I stood silently in the narrow entryway, watching these supposedly refined high society elites scurry through my home like starved rats. They had completely abandoned their facade of superiority. They were nothing but terrified thieves. "You are looking in the wrong place," I said. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through the chaos like a razor blade. All four of them froze instantly. Brittany dropped a handful of my dresses. Susan gasped, dropping a stack of my bank statements. Richard slowly stood up from the wreckage of my framed photos, his face pale and slick with sweat. DeAndre whipped around to face me. The charming, smooth-talking real estate broker who had mocked me just hours ago was completely gone. His eyes were bloodshot and wild. His chest heaved as he stared at me, calculating his next move. He did not look at my face. His eyes locked directly onto the heavy leather tote bag clutched tightly against my side. He knew immediately that I had beat them to the prize. "Give me the bag," Claire DeAndre demanded. His voice dropped into a low, desperate, threatening register that completely abandoned any pretense of familial connection. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight. "You broke into my home. You destroyed my property. You are trespassing, and you are close to adding a home invasion charge to your list of felonies. Get out." DeAndre let out a sharp, unhinged laugh. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, aggressive strides, stopping mere inches from my face. He tried to use his height and presence to intimidate me, looming over me like a shadow. I tilted my chin up, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to show even a sliver of fear. "You do not understand how this works," DeAndre hissed, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger at my face. "I am not playing games with you anymore. My entire real estate firm is heavily leveraged to the absolute brink. I have $50 million of investor capital tied up in shell companies and high-risk loans. I owe money to people who do not use the legal system to collect their debts. They use violence. They use extortion." He ran a trembling hand over his face, his panic bleeding through his aggressive posture. That land in Austin was my golden parachute. It was the only way I could secure a massive commercial loan to cover my deficits. I need that property to appease my board of directors. If I do not walk into my office on Monday morning with the deed to that $25 million commercial plot, the federal authorities will be raiding my firm by noon. I will undoubtedly face federal fraud charges. I will be indicted for mishandling investor money, and I will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I looked at him, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the cornered narcissist standing in my ruined living room. "You built a house of cards, DeAndre. You lied to your investors, you lied to my sister, and you lied to my parents to make them think you were a billionaire. And now, the wind is blowing. That is not my problem." He lunged forward, grabbing my upper arm with a bruising, desperate grip. "It is your problem!" he screamed, shaking me slightly. "Because you are going to hand over that bag right now. You are going to sign the transfer papers, and you are going to save my life. I will not let some miserable spinster ruin my empire." I glanced down at his hand gripping my arm, then back up to his wild, bloodshot eyes. "Take your hand off me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a glacial, terrifying calm. Richard stepped forward, sensing the physical escalation. "DeAndre, let her go," he ordered, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. "We can handle this logically, Claire. Be reasonable." I yanked my arm out of DeAndre's grip, stepping back and gripping my bag tighter. "There is no logic left here, Richard. You broke down my door. You are acting like common criminals because you realize your precious future son-in-law is broke. He is a desperate fraud, and you entirely sold your soul to impress him." Susan saw that DeAndre's physical aggression had failed. She knew violence would only push me further away, so she immediately pivoted to the only other weapon she knew how to wield: guilt. With a dramatic, theatrical wail, my mother collapsed onto the ruined hardwood floor. She fell to her knees right in the middle of my shredded blueprints and torn sofa cushions. Tears began streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out, grabbing the hem of my coat with trembling hands. "Claire, please," Susan sobbed, her voice echoing with a manufactured, hysterical desperation. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot let this happen. DeAndre's family is incredibly powerful in their social circles. If he goes to prison, they will cancel the wedding immediately. Brittany will be an absolute laughingstock. Every society page in the city will mock her. We will be ruined. Our reputation will never recover. You have to sign the land over to DeAndre. You have to save this family." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I watched her grovel on the floor of the apartment she had just helped destroy, begging me to sacrifice my grandfather's legacy just to preserve her fake social standing. The sheer audacity of her request was blinding. "Get up off the floor, Susan," I commanded, my voice devoid of a single ounce of warmth. "You are embarrassing yourself." Susan sobbed louder, clinging tighter to my coat. "No, I will not get up until you promise to help your sister. She is your blood, Claire. We are your blood." I yanked my coat out of her grasp, forcing her to fall forward onto her hands. "My blood," I repeated, the anger radiating from every syllable. "Just yesterday, you stood in your pristine living room and called me a failure. You called me a boring spinster who scrapes mold off bricks. You smiled while my father forged my signature on a legal bill of sale, and you cheered while your golden child stole my property to fund her vanity project. You did not care about my blood when you were robbing me blind." Brittany, who had been cowering near the bedroom door, wailed loudly. "I made a mistake, Claire. I was just stressed about the wedding." "You committed a felony, Brittany," I shot back, silencing her instantly. "And now you expect me to hand over a $25 million asset to save a thief and a fraud? You want me to bail out a man who lied to you about his wealth, a man who is facing federal prison for scamming his own investors. You are asking me to finance a criminal just so you can take pretty pictures in Dubai. The answer is no. Absolutely, unequivocally, no." The room fell dead silent. Susan's fake sobbing hitched in her throat. DeAndre looked like he was about to vomit. But Richard, my father, stepped forward. He did not look panicked anymore. He looked cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. He adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket, stepping over the debris on the floor, as if it did not exist. "You are being very short-sighted," Claire, Richard said, his voice dropping into a smooth, terrifyingly calm register. "You think you hold all the cards because you possess the physical deed and the legal right to the trust. You think your grandfather outsmarted me. But Thomas was an old man, and you are just a naive girl who does not understand how the real world operates." I tightened my grip on the heavy leather tote bag. "I understand perfectly well how the world operates, Richard. It operates on legal ownership, and I am the sole beneficiary." Richard smiled a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "Legal ownership only matters if you have the legal capacity to execute it." A sudden icy chill swept through my veins. "What are you talking about?" Richard crossed his arms behind his back, pacing slowly in front of me, like a shark circling its prey. He outlined his ultimate toxic plan with horrifying precision. "If you refuse to sign that property over to DeAndre by tomorrow," Richard stated, "I will make a phone call to Dr. Wallace. You remember Dr. Wallace, do you not? He is a very close, very loyal family friend. He also happens to be the chief of psychiatry at the most prestigious private clinic in the state." My stomach plummeted. Dr. Wallace had prescribed my anxiety medication when I was a struggling college student. He was the one who had handled my panic attacks when my parents had threatened to cut off my tuition. "I spoke with Dr. Wallace this morning after you stormed out of our house," Richard continued, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "I expressed my deep fatherly concern about your erratic behavior. I told him you were suffering from severe delusions, that you were making wild accusations against your family, and that you were entirely incapable of managing your own affairs. Dr. Wallace agreed that your past history of severe panic attacks and mental instability makes you a prime candidate for a full psychiatric evaluation. You cannot do that, I breathed, the sheer evil of his plan paralyzing me for a fraction of a second. I am a successful business owner. I am completely sane. Richard let out a sharp, dismissive bark of laughter. Sanity is subjective, Claire, especially when a respected medical professional signs a sworn affidavit stating that you are a danger to yourself and your assets. If you do not sign that deed over to DeAndre, we will file an emergency petition with the court first thing on Monday morning. We will have you declared mentally incompetent. We will use your past therapy, your anxiety medication, and your supposed erratic behavior today to prove our case. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my face. Once the judge signs the order, I will be granted full legal conservatorship over you. I will control your business, your bank accounts, and most importantly, your grandfather's trust. I will sign the Austin property over to DeAndre myself as your legal guardian. You will be locked in a psychiatric facility for observation, and by the time you manage to prove your sanity, the land will be gone, DeAndre's debts will be paid, and the Dubai wedding will proceed exactly as planned. The gravity of his threat hung in the ruined apartment, heavy and suffocating. He was threatening to strip away my basic human rights. He was willing to have his own daughter institutionalized, branded as crazy, and stripped of her autonomy, all to cover up a financial crime and save face in front of high society. It was the ultimate toxic parent maneuver, a nuclear option designed to break me completely. The tension in the room grew so suffocating that I could barely draw a full breath into my lungs. DeAndre began pacing the narrow perimeter of my destroyed living room like a caged animal. His expensive dress shoes crushed the scattered remains of my architectural blueprints with every heavy step he took. The erratic movement only added to the terrifying claustrophobic atmosphere they were actively building around me. He muttered under his breath, his hands rubbing his face, the sheer panic of his impending federal fraud charges leaking through his expensive tailored suit. Brittany sensed my temporary paralysis, immediately launched into a screeching tirade, emboldened by our father's horrific threat. She stepped up right beside Richard, her face twisted with a vicious, triumphant sneer. "You hear that, Claire?" she taunted, her voice echoing shrilly off the bare walls. "You are a jealous, bitter spinster who cannot stand to see anyone else happy. You have spent your entire life hoarding your little accomplishments because no one actually wants you. Now you are trying to ruin my beautiful fairy tale life just because you are miserable and alone. You are sick in the head. Dad is right. You need to be locked up or you cannot hurt normal people anymore." Susan flanked my other side, her fake tears completely gone now. The mask of the grieving, desperate mother evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating woman who was ready to watch her own daughter be institutionalized for a wedding deposit. She nodded vigorously along with Brittany's insults. "We are only doing this because we love you," Susan lied, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. "You clearly cannot manage this kind of wealth. Your grandfather made a massive mistake, and we are simply correcting it to protect you from yourself. You have always been the broken one, Claire. It is time you finally accept our help." They began to move closer, narrowing the circle. The four of them physically surrounded me in the center of my own home. DeAndre stopped pacing and blocked the hallway leading to the front door, crossing his arms and glaring at me with raw desperation. Richard stood directly in front of me, tall and unyielding, a smug smile playing on his lips. Susan and Brittany boxed me in from the sides, cutting off any path to the kitchen or the fire escape. The air grew thick and hot. I gripped the leather strap of my tote bag so tightly, my nails dug into my own palms, the sharp pain serving as my only tether to reality. They had effectively trapped me in a physical and psychological cage, and they were waiting for me to break. My mind raced at a frantic, terrifying speed. I forced myself to ignore the screaming, to ignore the physical threat of DeAndre blocking the door, and to focus entirely on the cold, hard logic of my father's ultimatum. I knew Richard well enough to understand that he never made empty threats. He was absolutely ruthless enough to drag me through a lengthy, humiliating legal battle over my mental state. I had seen him destroy corporate rivals using identical underhanded tactics, manipulating the legal system until his opponents were completely bled dry. He viewed me as just another rival blocking his acquisition. If I refused to sign that document right now, he would make that phone call to Dr. Wallace the second he stepped out of my apartment. By Monday morning, a corrupt psychiatric evaluation would be filed with the local court. The judge, seeing a sworn affidavit from a prominent chief of psychiatry and backed by a wealthy, upstanding family, would likely grant the emergency conservatorship without hesitation. The consequences flashed before my eyes with brutal clarity. The court order would instantly freeze all of my personal and business accounts. My architectural conservation firm, the business I had built from the ground up with my own blood, sweat, and tears, would be paralyzed. The bank would lock me out of my own operating funds. I would not be able to pay my staff, secure my historical preservation grants, or fulfill my contracts. My clients, wealthy investors who valued discretion and stability above all else, would flee the moment the rumor of my mental incompetence reached their ears. I could fight it, of course. I could hire my own lawyers, demand independent psychological evaluations, and battle Richard in the courtroom. But that process would take months, perhaps even years. During that time, my father would have total control over my grandfather's trust. He would forge my signature, transfer the Austin property to DeAndre, and the $25 million asset would be swallowed by DeAndre's massive corporate debt before I even saw the inside of a courtroom. I would win the war, eventually, but I would lose everything else in the process. My business would be dead, my reputation would be shattered. My grandfather's legacy would be paved over by a desperate fraud. I could not fight them in this room. That was the stark, terrifying realization that washed over me. In the dark, behind closed doors, my family held all the power. They had the connections, the corrupt friends, and the complete lack of moral boundaries required to win a dirty fight. If I tried to battle them here in the shadows of my ruined apartment, they would suffocate me with their lies and influence. They would isolate me, discredit me, and strip away everything I had worked for. I needed a different battleground. I needed a place where Richard could not hide behind his corporate respectability. I needed a place where Susan could not play the victim without being scrutinized. I needed an arena where DeAndre's flashy lies would be exposed to the very people he was trying to scam. I needed a public stage. If I was going to destroy them, I had to do it completely, absolutely, and in front of an audience they could not control or manipulate. I needed hundreds of witnesses. I needed the high society elites they worshipped to see exactly who they were. I had to let them believe they had won. Let them lower their guard and lure them out into the blinding light of public scrutiny. The plan formed in my mind with a cold, terrifying precision. I knew exactly what I had to do, and I knew exactly where I had to do it. The trap was set, but they were the ones standing inside it. I let my shoulders slump forward deliberately, releasing the rigid posture I had maintained since walking into the room. I let out a long, shuddering sigh, allowing the exhaustion I genuinely felt to bleed into my voice and expression. I looked down at the ruined floorboards, breaking eye contact with my father to signal absolute submission. "You win," I whispered, making sure my voice trembled just enough to be convincing. I will not fight you anymore. I cannot afford a legal war, and I cannot lose my firm. You know that. Susan immediately clapped her hands together, a sharp, piercing sound of victory. I knew you would see reason, Claire, she declared, her tone instantly switching back to that sickeningly sweet maternal register. This is what family does. We compromise for the greater good. I kept my eyes downcast, playing the broken daughter to perfection. I will sign the transfer documents, I said slowly, measuring every single word. I will legally sign the deed of trust over to DeAndre. But I have one absolute condition. If I am giving up my grandfather's legacy to fund this family's future, I am not doing it in the shadows of a destroyed apartment. I will only sign the papers tomorrow night at Brittany and DeAndre's pre-wedding gala. Richard frowned slightly, his suspicion flaring. Why? What does the venue matter as long as the ink dries? Because I want the recognition I lied feeding directly into their own narcissistic value system. I want to stand on that stage in front of your high society friends, your investors, and DeAndre's family. I want everyone in that room to know that I am the one saving this wedding. I want the public credit for being the generous sister who gifted a massive real estate empire to bless this union. I want you to acknowledge my sacrifice in front of everyone. And I added, raising my head to look directly at DeAndre. I want the Mustang returned to my garage by noon tomorrow. You have the buyer's proxy information. Cancel the sale, refund his $45,000, and get my car back. That is my price. DeAndre and Richard exchanged a long, calculating look. I could practically see the gears turning in their heads. To them, my request made perfect, pathetic sense. In their world, public validation was the ultimate currency. They assumed I was just like them, desperate for applause and desperate to be seen as the hero of the family narrative. The idea that I was willing to trade $25 million for a moment of social glory in a rusty old car confirmed everything they had always believed about my supposed inferiority. Richard's chest puffed out with arrogant satisfaction. He smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile of a man who believed he had completely crushed his opponent's spirit. Done, Richard agreed, his voice echoing with absolute authority. We will arrange a special presentation during the gala tomorrow evening. You will hand over the deed, sign the transfer documents in front of our guests, and we will publicly thank you for your generosity. DeAndre will handle the car buyer first thing in the morning. DeAndre nodded eagerly, the frantic desperation leaving his eyes, replaced once again by that unbearable, flashy confidence. Consider the car yours, Claire. I will wire the funds back to the broker and have it towed to your place by noon. See, we can all be reasonable when we try. Brittany squealed with delight, rushing forward to throw her arms around me in a suffocating fake embrace. Oh, Claire, thank you. I promise I will make sure the photographer gets a great shot of you handing over the papers. It is going to look so amazing on my feed. I stood rigidly enduring her embrace without returning it. Susan patted my cheek, her diamond rings cold against my skin. Be at the hotel ballroom by 7 o'clock sharp, she instructed. Wear something elegant. Try not to look so tired. With their victories secured, the four of them turned and walked out of my apartment, stepping over my shredded belongings as if they were nothing more than street garbage. They did not offer to help clean up the destruction they had caused. They had gotten what they wanted, and I had served my purpose. The second the broken wooden door clicked shut behind them, the defeated posture melted from my body. My spine straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The air in the room felt lighter, cleared of their toxic, suffocating presence. My demeanor shifted into pure, razor-sharp ice. I walked over to my overturned desk, righted a fallen chair, and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I navigated to my recent calls list and pressed the number for the classic car restoration shop. Hector answered on the first ring. Is he still there? I asked, my tone strictly business. He is pacing a hole in my concrete floor, Claire Hector replied, his voice tense. He is threatening to buy the entire block just to evict me if I do not hand over the keys. You need to talk to him, put him on the phone, I commanded. A moment later, a deep, cultured voice came through the receiver. You are playing a very dangerous game, Claire Harrison, warned, his words clipped and impatient. I offered you $1 million to walk away. If you think you can hold me hostage for more, you are gravely miscalculating my resources. Mr. Harrison, I interrupted, cutting off his corporate intimidation tactics. I am not selling the Austin land to you. Not for $1 million and not for $25 million. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The billionaire was not used to being told no. Before he could unleash his fury, I continued, seamlessly laying out the exact parameters of the trap I had built. But I am willing to transfer the entire plot to the State Historical Conservation Fund that your holding company actively sponsors, I said. I know you use that conservation fund for massive corporate tax write-offs. I know you need high-value land donations to offset your annual capital gains. I will sign the trust over to your conservation fund in perpetuity, guaranteeing that no commercial developer will ever touch that land. Harrison fell silent. The brilliance of the maneuver was not lost on him. What are your terms? He asked, his voice suddenly stripped of all arrogance, replaced by absolute professional focus. In exchange for the land transfer, I want $15 million wired into an offshore account of my choosing by Monday morning, I stated. I want the Mustang fully released back into my legal possession immediately. And, most importantly, I want you to put on your best suit and attend a high society gala tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Harrison let out a low, intrigued hum. A gala? Why would I waste my Friday evening at a social event? Because I said, a cold smile finally breaking across my face. DeAndre's real estate firm is hosting it. I know his company owes your investment group $50 million. I know his debt is overdue, and I know he is desperate. Do you want to stand in a 5-star ballroom tomorrow night and watch the men who owe you money burn to the ground? The silence on the line was profound, heavy with the weight of impending destruction. When Harrison finally spoke, his voice carried the dark, satisfied thrill of a predator who had just been invited to a feast. I will clear my schedule, Claire. Send me the address. I ended the call and immediately sent the location pin for the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel to his private encrypted number. The trap was fully armed. True to his word, DeAndre had the Mustang towed back to my apartment complex early the next morning. Hector met me there to verify the vehicle was unharmed. The classic car sat gleaming in the morning light, safely returned to my possession. With the physical asset secured, I spent the rest of the day preparing my wardrobe and finalizing the legal documents Elaine had drawn up for the Conservation Trust transfer. By 7 o'clock that evening, I stepped out of a hired black car and handed the keys to the valet outside the hyper-exclusive 5-star hotel. The St. Regis was a monument to old money and architectural grandeur. The exact kind of venue my parents used to validate their social existence. I walked through the towering glass doors and followed the gilded signage directing guests to the pre-wedding gala. The grand ballroom was a staggering display of overcompensation. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, fracturing light over the extravagant gathering. A towering champagne pyramid stood perfectly constructed in the center of the room, with white-gloved waiters expertly pouring vintage reserves. Silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and artisan hors d'oeuvres circulated seamlessly through the crowd. DeAndre had spared absolutely no expense, or rather, he had maximized his remaining credit limits to project an illusion of infinite wealth. The room was packed wall-to-wall with the local elite. I recognized dozens of influential figures from the city commercial real estate sector. DeAndre had invited all his elite investors, the very people he was actively defrauding, to witness his supposed triumph. My father Richard was working the room with equal fervor. He was shaking hands with his corporate partners and high society socialites, laughing heartily and playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. They were all wearing masks of invincibility, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was rigged with explosives. I watched Richard clink his glass with a local politician, his booming laugh carrying over the string quartet. He looked so incredibly proud of the extortion he had pulled off in my living room. He genuinely believed that his threats of a corrupt psychiatric hold had permanently silenced me. Susan was fluttering around him, pointing out the caviar stations to other wealthy wives, acting as if she had personally orchestrated this entire display of prosperity. The arrogance radiating from my family was almost suffocating. They felt absolutely untouchable. I moved silently along the perimeter of the ballroom, keeping to the edges to observe the ecosystem of lies. It did not take long to spot my sister. Brittany was entirely in her element, vibrating with a manic, narcissistic energy that demanded attention from every corner of the room. She was wearing a custom silk gown that looked wildly out of place for a pre-wedding event, but it was the jewelry that caught my eye. Resting heavily against her collarbone was a staggering diamond necklace. The stones were massive and flawless. I knew her financial reality. I knew that $50,000 piece of jewelry was bought on credit, a desperate addition to her mounting debt, designed solely to make her look like royalty for the cameras. She was holding her phone extended on a carbon fiber selfie stick, aggressively panning the camera across the opulent ballroom. She was actively live-streaming to her thousands of followers, shoving the lens into the faces of passing waiters and wealthy guests. Her voice pierced through the ambient classical music playing in the background. "Look at this chandelier, guys!" Brittany squealed to her digital audience, spinning in a slow circle to catch the light on her diamonds. DeAndre just knows exactly how to spoil me. Tonight is our VIP gala before we jet off to Dubai, and I have the most insane surprise to share with you all. She paused, striking a highly rehearsed pose for the camera, tossing her hair over her shoulder. My family is literally the best. My older sister is stepping up tonight to gift us a massive real estate dowry. We are talking prime, ultra-exclusive commercial acreage in Texas to add to DeAndre's portfolio. It is worth tens of millions, and she is just handing it over to bless our union. That is just how the Blackwell family operates. Generational wealth, baby. We take care of our own. I stood behind a marble pillar, listening to her weave this pathetic delusion. The sheer audacity to frame my stolen inheritance as her dowry was nauseating. She genuinely believed her own lies. She was soaking in the virtual validation from her followers, thriving on the envy of strangers. Her delusion was at its absolute peak. She thought she had completely conquered me. She thought her bullying and my father's blackmail had successfully broken my spirit, transforming me into a compliant background character in her fabricated fairy tale. She was utterly convinced I was here to surrender. A few yards away from Brittany's digital performance, DeAndre was holding court with a circle of older, sharp-eyed men in tailored suits. These were his primary investors, the men whose money he had mismanaged and squandered on luxury cars and extravagant parties. DeAndre was leaning in, slapping them on the shoulder, speaking in hushed, confident tones. I could read his body language perfectly. He was sweating slightly despite the heavy air conditioning. He was gripping his scotch glass a fraction too tightly. He was promising them unprecedented returns. He was assuring them that the Austin property acquisition was finalized and that their capital was secure. He was buying himself time with a currency he did not actually possess, stringing these powerful men along with the promise of my grandfather's land. I smoothed the fabric of my own dress, a sharp, minimalist navy gown that felt like armor. I took a deep breath, letting the chaotic noise of the ballroom wash over me. The stage was set perfectly. The audience was primed. The thieves were celebrating their victory, drinking champagne paid for with stolen funds. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar and walked directly into the blinding light of the chandeliers. It was time to start the show. I moved deliberately through the sea of guests, allowing the sharp lines of my minimalist navy gown to part the crowd. I did not look like the defeated, frantic woman they had cornered in a ruined apartment the day before. I looked like power personified. The dark fabric of my dress felt like armor, projecting a cold, untouchable energy that made several high society guests turn their heads. I was no longer the invisible, boring sister who scraped mold off bricks. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and I walked with the absolute certainty of a woman holding the detonator to their fake world. Before I could cross the center of the ballroom, a hand clamped down on my bicep with the force of a steel vice. I did not flinch, though the manicured acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin through my sleeves. I turned my head slowly to find my mother, Susan, materializing beside me. Her smile remained plastered on her face for the benefit of the watching crowd, but her eyes were manic and vicious. "Smile, Claire." Susan hissed her voice, barely a breath against my ear, hidden by the loud chatter of the gala and the string quartet. "Do not look so stiff. You are supposed to be the generous, loving sister tonight. We have extremely important investors watching our every single move. Do not embarrass us. Play your part. Smile for the cameras, hand over the deed when your father calls you to the stage, and then you can go back to your miserable little life." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, then met her furious gaze with zero emotion. "Take your hand off me, Susan," I commanded. My tone was so glacial that she blinked in genuine surprise, her grip loosening instinctively. "I am here to deliver exactly what this family deserves. I will put on a performance that no one in this room will ever forget. Now step back and maintain your precious smile before you ruin your own perfect image." Susan swallowed hard, unsettled by my lack of fear. But she quickly masked it with a bright, artificial laugh. She grabbed a champagne flute and linked her arm forcefully through mine, presenting the illusion of a close mother and daughter dynamic. "Come along," Susan ordered through gritted teeth, steering me toward a cluster of high-top tables near the front of the stage. "You need to meet DeAndre's parents. They have been asking about the sister who is providing the dowry. Be extremely polite. They are very prominent people." She dragged me toward an older African-American couple holding court near the front row. DeAndre's parents were dressed in a way that aggressively screamed new money. His mother was draped in an ostentatious heavy gold necklace that practically blinded anyone looking directly at it. Her wrists stacked high with thick diamond tennis bracelets that clashed loudly with her heavily sequined evening gown. His father wore a custom tuxedo that fit just a fraction too tight, aggressively displaying a massive, gaudy luxury watch. They reeked of heavily financed wealth, projecting an image of undeniable success that I knew for a fact was built entirely on a mountain of fraudulent debt. Mr. and Mrs. Washington Susan greeted them, her voice dripping with syrupy sweetness. "I am so thrilled to introduce you to my eldest daughter, Claire. She is the one who will be presenting the Austin property transfer tonight." DeAndre's mother let out a loud, booming laugh and grabbed my hands with her heavily jeweled fingers. "Oh, we have heard so much about your little gift," she exclaimed, her voice carrying over the music. "DeAndre is an absolute genius in the commercial sector. He told us all about how he plans to develop that empty plot of land in Austin. It is a brilliant move. He is going to turn that dusty dirt into a billion-dollar tech hub." DeAndre's father puffed out his chest, adjusting his diamond cufflinks. "My son is a titan in the industry, Claire. He has global investors practically begging on their knees to give him capital. This Austin acquisition is going to put our family name on the map permanently. We are so glad you realized that a powerful man like DeAndre could put that land to much better use than a single woman working some blue-collar historical job. It takes a real businessman to handle assets of that magnitude. The sheer ignorance of their boasting was astounding. They actually believed every single lie their son had fed them. They honestly thought DeAndre was a real estate mogul conquering the corporate world. They had absolutely no idea that he was drowning in $50 million of borrowed capital, or that the jewelry they were currently wearing would likely be repossessed by federal investigators before the end of the week. They were feeding off his delusion, happily participating in the scam while mocking my profession. I merely smiled, offering them a perfectly polite, completely hollow expression. "I am absolutely thrilled to be here," I replied smoothly, my voice carrying a sharp edge of irony that flew completely over their heads. "I cannot wait to see exactly what happens when the truth about DeAndre's empire is revealed to everyone in this room. I am sure it will be a historic moment for your family." DeAndre's mother laughed again, completely missing the blatant threat woven into my words. "That is the spirit," she cheered. "We are building a dynasty tonight." Just then, DeAndre materialized beside his parents, his eyes darting nervously between my calm face and his mother's oblivious joy. "Mom, Dad, I see you met Claire," DeAndre said, forcing a tight, anxious smile. "Claire is just thrilled to contribute to the family legacy. Is that not right, Claire?" His eyes bore into mine, silently pleading and threatening me all at once. He was terrified I would expose his bankruptcy to his parents right then and there. I held his terrified gaze and gave him a slow, knowing nod. "More than you could ever possibly imagine, DeAndre," I answered, my voice dropping to a register only he could fully understand. "I brought everything you asked for." DeAndre exhaled a sharp breath of relief, foolishly believing that my compliance was genuine. He patted his father's shoulder and turned back to the crowd, completely unaware that his entire fraudulent life was currently standing on a trapdoor. I stepped back from the group, folding my hands perfectly in front of me, and waited for my father to take the stage. The overture was finished. The main event was about to begin. A sharp, ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom. Richard stood at the center of the elevated stage, methodically tapping a heavy silver spoon against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The sharp tone demanded absolute obedience. Conversations halted instantly. Waiters froze in place holding silver trays of caviar perfectly still. The string quartet lowered their bows, plunging the massive, opulent space into total silence. Every face in the crowd turned toward the front, their eyes drawn to the patriarch who was about to deliver his masterpiece of manipulation. I stood perfectly still near the back of the room, my hands resting lightly against the sleek fabric of my navy gown. My heart beat a slow, measured rhythm against my ribs. The trap was springing exactly as I had anticipated. Richard adjusted the microphone stand with a practiced, authoritative grip. He looked out over the sea of high society elites, corporate investors, and prominent local politicians, allowing a warm, utterly fabricated smile to spread across his face. He was the picture of the benevolent father, the successful titan of industry, welcoming his peers to celebrate his family. "Good evening, everyone," Richard began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, rich with artificial emotion. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the upcoming union of two remarkable families. When DeAndre asked for my daughter Brittany's hand in marriage, I knew immediately that this was not just a merging of two hearts, but the merging of two powerful legacies." He paused, allowing a polite ripple of applause to wash over the ballroom. DeAndre stood a few feet away on the stage, puffing his chest out, adjusting his expensive tie. He radiated an unbearable level of smug satisfaction. "Family is the foundation of everything we build in this world," Richard continued, his tone dropping into a serious, reverent register. In the business world, we talk about assets, acquisitions, and capital. But the true currency of a lasting empire is loyalty. It is the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. It is the bond that ensures the next generation can climb even higher than the last. Tonight, we are here to witness the ultimate display of that familial devotion. I watched him weave his web of lies, marveling at his sheer sociopathic grace. He was building a narrative prison around me, right in front of my eyes. He was framing my impending surrender not as a coerced theft, but as an act of noble sacrifice. He was making sure that if I hesitated, or if I backed down, I would be the one destroying this beautiful, perfect family moment. He was utilizing the immense social pressure of the entire room to force my compliance. As a father, there is nothing more beautiful than watching your children support one another, Richard said, placing a hand over his heart, executing the emotional performance of a lifetime. Brittany has always been the light of our family, bringing joy and beauty to everything she touches. But my eldest daughter, Claire, has always possessed a different kind of strength. She is the quiet protector, the one who understands the true value of preserving our family heritage. He looked directly at me then. A spotlight shifted, cutting through the dim ballroom to illuminate exactly where I stood. Hundreds of pairs of eyes followed the beam of light, locking onto me in unison. The heavy, suffocating pressure of their collective gaze settled onto my shoulders. I did not flinch. I kept my chin elevated, my expression utterly unreadable. Recently, our family was blessed with a significant piece of undeveloped commercial land in the heart of Austin, Texas, Richard announced, projecting his voice to ensure every investor in the room heard the specific location. It is a highly coveted asset, one that requires a visionary mind to develop properly. A visionary mind exactly like my future son-in-law, DeAndre. A low murmur of impressed approval rippled through the crowd. DeAndre's investors, the men he was actively scamming, nodded to one another, clearly relieved that their capital was apparently secure. They were buying the lie completely. Richard extended his hand toward the edge of the stage in a sweeping, theatrical gesture. Claire understands that this land is not meant to sit idle. She knows that DeAndre possesses the genius to turn that acreage into a commercial triumph. And so, in a profound act of sisterly love and family unity, Claire has chosen to legally gift this $25 million estate to DeAndre and Brittany as their wedding dowry tonight. The ballroom erupted into genuine, thunderous applause. People were clapping, raising their glasses, completely taken in by the spectacle of immense wealth changing hands so casually. Brittany stepped into the center of the stage, her phone attached to a sleek, carbon fiber selfie stick, the ring light casting a bright, artificial glow over her face. She was live streaming the entire event to thousands of followers online, capturing the applause, ensuring the narrative of her incredible windfall was permanently recorded on the internet. She was literally broadcasting her own impending doom, completely blinded by her desperate need for digital validation. DeAndre stepped forward next to her, pulling a crisp, heavy legal document from inside his tailored jacket. It was the deed transfer. He placed it carefully on a small, velvet-draped podium positioned in the center of the stage. He reached into his pocket and produced a heavy silver fountain pen, holding it up for the crowd to see. He looked directly at me, a victorious, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He thought he had completely conquered me. He thought the sheer weight of this public spectacle would force me to walk up there and sign my life away just to avoid a scene. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my brilliant, generous daughter Claire to the stage to officially sign the deed transfer, Richard announced, clapping his hands together, prompting the crowd to cheer louder. The spotlight tracked me as I took my first step forward. The walk toward the stage felt incredibly long, each step echoing in my own mind against the roaring applause of the ballroom. I moved slowly, deliberately, evaluating the psychological architecture of the room. I could feel my mother Susan glaring at me from her table, her eyes silently threatening me to comply. I saw DeAndre's parents, beaming with unearned pride, completely ignorant of the financial abyss waiting to swallow them whole. I ascended the short flight of carpeted stairs leading up to the stage. The heat from the professional lighting washed over me. Brittany shoved her phone camera directly toward my face, capturing my arrival for her live audience, screeching about how much she loved her big sister. DeAndre held the silver pen out toward me, tapping the tip against the signature line of the transfer document, his eyes mocking me, daring me to refuse in front of a room full of powerful elites. I stopped in front of the podium. I looked down at the forged transfer documents, then looked at the silver pen resting in DeAndre's outstretched hand. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. The applause slowly died down, replaced by a thick, heavy anticipation. The entire room waited for me to capitulate. They waited for me to sign away my grandfather's legacy to a broke, fraudulent bully. I did not take the pen. I took a deep breath, preparing to tear the roof off their entire fraudulent existence. I stepped past DeAndre, completely ignoring the silver fountain pen he was holding out to me like a royal scepter. He frowned, a flash of irritation crossing his perfectly groomed features as he tried to subtly push the pen back into my line of sight. I reached past him and smoothly lifted the microphone from its heavy brass stand. The sharp screech of audio feedback briefly pierced the air, silencing the last remaining murmurs in the massive ballroom. Every single eye was glued to me. I turned my body away from my seething father and my panicked future brother-in-law. I looked directly toward the back of the room, past the glittering chandeliers and the champagne towers, right up to the elevated audiovisual booth. I caught the eye of the lead technician, a young man I had handed $2,000 in cash just hours before this gala began. I gave him a single sharp nod. The technician did not hesitate. He cut the ambient lighting in the ballroom by half, plunging the audience into a dramatic, theatrical dimness. The motorized velvet curtains behind the stage parted with a heavy mechanical hum, revealing a massive 20-foot projector screen. Brittany gasped in delight, clearly thinking this was a surprise slideshow of her engagement photos. She thrust her phone high into the air on her selfie stick, making sure her thousands of live stream viewers had a perfect view of the screen. But the image that flashed across the enormous display was not a romantic photo of the happy couple. It was a high-resolution scan of a highly incriminating legal document. The stark white paper and stark black ink glared down at the hundreds of elite guests. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice was razor-sharp, carrying a glacial authority that echoed off the marble walls and completely shattered the fairy-tale atmosphere. "Before I sign anything," I announced, ensuring my enunciation was perfectly clear for both the wealthy audience in the room and the thousands of people currently watching my sister's livestream. I wanted to share a heartwarming story about how my sister secured the deposit for her luxurious Dubai wedding. A wave of confused whispers rippled through the front rows. DeAndre lowered the silver pen, his brow furrowing as he turned to look at the massive screen behind him. Richard took a sudden, aggressive step forward, recognizing the document instantly, but he was too far away to snatch the microphone from my hands. "She did it by stealing my grandfather's classic car, forging my signature, and committing felony grand theft," I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. A collective, audible gasp swept through the five-star ballroom. The wealthy socialites, the corporate partners, and the elite investors all stared at the 20-foot screen in absolute shock. The document projected behind me was undeniable. It was the forged bill of sale for the 1968 Ford Mustang. I had instructed the technician to zoom in specifically on the signature line, clearly showing the poorly replicated forgery of my name. Right next to it, glaring in high definition, was the official notary stamp of my father Richard, proving he had authenticated a stolen asset. Beside me on the stage, the facade completely collapsed. Brittany went ashen, all the color draining from her perfectly contoured face. Her mouth fell open in a silent scream of absolute horror. Her trembling hand lost its grip. The heavy carbon fiber selfie stick slipped from her fingers and crashed violently onto the hardwood stage. The expensive phone clattered across the floor, the camera lens still angled up, continuing to broadcast her utter humiliation to the internet.
"That is a lie,"
Richard bellowed, his voice raw with sudden panic. He lunged toward me, trying to physically block the audience from seeing the screen. "Turn that projector off immediately! She is having a mental episode! Someone cut her microphone!" But the technician had locked the booth door exactly as I instructed. The image remained burned onto the screen. I easily sidestepped my father, keeping the microphone firmly in my grasp, refusing to let him silence the truth. "It is not a lie, Richard I," countered smoothly, addressing the crowd directly. "The man trying to silence me right now is the same man who notarized that forged document. My own father used his corporate credentials to facilitate the theft of a classic vehicle valued at over $250,000. He risked his entire professional reputation just to ensure his golden child could afford a destination wedding." The murmurs in the crowd escalated into loud, scandalized chatter. I could see DeAndre's parents in the front row, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. The high society guests, the people my mother had spent decades trying to impress, were now pointing at the screen and whispering furiously to one another. Susan was frozen at her table, her hands covering her face, realizing that her pristine social standing was evaporating in real time. The elite investors sitting near the front began to exchange highly alarmed looks, realizing that the family they were backing was entirely compromised by blatant criminality. "This is an outrage," DeAndre shouted, stepping in front of Brittany to shield her from the glaring light of the projector. "You are ruining our night over a piece of scrap metal. Security, get her off this stage right now. Do not listen to her. She is completely unhinged." I turned my glacial stare directly onto DeAndre. He was sweating profusely now, the terrified reality of his situation bleeding through his custom suit. He knew this was just the beginning. I had entirely hijacked his stage, and he was powerless to stop the demolition. The very people he relied on to fund his fraudulent lifestyle were watching his future bride be exposed as a common thief. The camera on the floor continued to stream the entire disaster. I could almost visualize the thousands of comments flooding Brittany's social media feed, watching her curated influencer lifestyle burn to ashes in real time. The wealthy guests who had been drinking DeAndre's champagne just moments ago were now pulling out their own phones recording the scene on the stage. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The family that had physically backed me into a corner and threatened me with institutionalization 24 hours ago was now trapped under the merciless spotlight of public scrutiny. There was no corrupt psychiatrist to save them here. There was only the undeniable, glaring evidence of their own corruption, projected for the entire city elite to see. "You should be very careful about calling security, DeAndre," I warned him, making sure the microphone caught every single syllable. "Because Grand Theft Auto is only the first layer of the rot I am exposing tonight. My sister might be a thief, but she is an absolute amateur compared to the man she is about to marry." DeAndre froze, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what was coming next. The audience leaned in, utterly captivated by the catastrophic implosion of this high society union. The silence in the ballroom was no longer polite. It was predatory. They were sharks, smelling blood in the water, and I was about to serve them an absolute feast. DeAndre's pristine facade finally cracked under the crushing pressure of imminent destruction. With a guttural, furious shout, he abandoned all pretense of high society elegance and lunged directly across the stage. His hands clawed toward the microphone, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. "She is having a mental breakdown," DeAndre bellowed, his voice cracking with pure feral panic. He waved his arms wildly at the security guards standing near the ballroom exit. "Cut the power! Right now! Someone tackle her and get that microphone out of her hands! She is completely delusional!" I stepped back with effortless grace, easily sidestepping his desperate, frantic grab. I did not need the microphone anymore to deliver the killing blow. I had already established a secure Bluetooth connection to the main audio mixing board when I paid off the technician earlier that evening. I reached into the pocket of my navy gown and retrieved my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the media player screen. I looked DeAndre dead in the eyes, watching the raw terror paralyze his features. Then I firmly pressed play. The high-fidelity surround sound system of the St. Regis Hotel was designed to amplify symphony orchestras and international keynote speakers. Tonight, it broadcast the raw, unedited truth of a cornered criminal. A sharp burst of static crackled through the air, immediately followed by the unmistakable, desperate voice of DeAndre echoing off the crystal chandeliers. The audio recording from my destroyed apartment played with crystal clear precision. "I am not playing games with you anymore." The recorded voice of DeAndre hissed through the speakers, dripping with violent aggression. "My entire real estate firm is heavily leveraged to the absolute brink. I have $50 million of investor capital tied up in shell companies and high-risk loans. I owe money to people who do not use the legal system to collect their debts." The transformation in the ballroom was instantaneous and catastrophic. The polite, hushed whispers of the elite crowd vanished, replaced by a collective, horrified gasp that sucked all the oxygen out of the massive space. The men in the tailored suits who had been eagerly discussing their portfolios with DeAndre just minutes ago suddenly froze their champagne flutes, stopping halfway to their mouths. The recording continued, mercilessly amplifying DeAndre's deepest secrets to the exact people he had spent years defrauding. "That land in Austin was my golden parachute," the audio blared, capturing the exact moment his facade broke in my living room. "I need that property to appease my board of directors. If I do not walk into my office on Monday morning with the deed to that $25 million commercial plot, the federal authorities will be raiding my firm by noon. I will undoubtedly face federal fraud charges. I will be indicted for mishandling investor money, and I will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The impact of those words hitting the crowd was like a bomb detonating in a glass house. Complete and utter bedlam erupted in the front rows. 3 distinguished gentlemen, the primary investors DeAndre had been schmoozing, shot up from their seats so fast they knocked their heavy dining chairs backward onto the thick carpet. One of them pulled out his phone, his face contorted in absolute unbridled rage, screaming at his assistant to freeze every single escrow account connected to DeAndre's firm. Another investor began shouting for the hotel staff to lock the doors and call the police. To my left, the devastating reality crashed down on DeAndre's parents. His mother let out a strangled, high-pitched wail, grabbing her chest as if she had been physically struck. The ostentatious gold necklace she had boasted about earlier suddenly looked like a heavy chain of evidence. She staggered backward, collapsing into the arms of a terrified waiter. His father stared at the stage with wide, unblinking eyes, his mouth opening and closing silently as the illusion of his son's financial genius evaporated into thin air. They realized in a matter of seconds that their lavish lifestyle, the expensive suits and the diamond jewelry, were entirely funded by stolen investor capital. They were quite literally wearing federal evidence. On stage, DeAndre stood absolutely paralyzed. His arms hung limply by his sides. He stared up at the ceiling speakers, his chest heaving, listening to his own voice destroy his entire existence. The arrogant, untouchable broker was gone, replaced by a terrified criminal who knew there was nowhere left to run. He looked out at the angry mob of investors closing in on the stage, the reality of his 20-year prison sentence settling over him like a shroud. Beside him, Brittany was curled on the floor next to her shattered phone. The reality of her situation finally breached her narcissistic delusion. She was not marrying a billionaire real estate mogul. She was engaged to a bankrupt felon, and she had committed grand theft auto just to secure a deposit for a wedding that would never happen. She covered her ears, weeping uncontrollably, realizing that her desperate need for social validation had ruined her entire life. My father, Richard, grasped the edge of a nearby catering table, his face a sickly shade of gray. The legendary corporate shark had been completely outmaneuvered and publicly humiliated by the daughter he had constantly dismissed. He had risked his professional notary license to help a man who was now publicly confessing to massive federal fraud. If investigators looked into the forged bill of sale on the projector screen, Richard would be disbarred and prosecuted as an accessory. My mother, Susan, stood frozen, clutching her pearl necklace, watching the elite society she worshipped turn their backs on her family in absolute disgust. The room swirled with frantic shouting, ringing cell phones, and the sharp glares of betrayed investors. The entire facade of wealth, success, and family unity was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. I remained perfectly still at the edge of the stage, my face a mask of cold satisfaction, watching the fire I started consume their entire fraudulent world. The heat of the stage lights beat down on me as the chaos in the ballroom reached a fever pitch. But the danger was not entirely neutralized. Richard, my father, finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. The realization that his prestigious notary license, his corporate reputation, and his entire social standing were going up in flames triggered a violent, desperate rage. His face turned a deep mottled purple. He lunged across the stage, throwing his massive frame toward me with a furious roar, intent on physically ripping the smartphone and the microphone from my hands to stop the bleeding. I braced myself, planting my heels firmly onto the hardwood floor, refusing to flinch or back away from the monster who raised me. But before his heavy hands could even graze the fabric of my navy gown, a booming, thunderous noise echoed from the back of the venue. The massive, heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom swung open with such violent force that they slammed against the marble walls, shattering the remaining ambient noise. Every head in the room whipped around. The angry investors, the panicking socialites, and my charging father all froze in place. Standing in the grand entryway, perfectly framed by the glittering light of the hallway chandeliers, was Harrison. The 60-year-old billionaire classic car collector stepped into the ballroom, radiating an aura of absolute terrifying power. He did not come alone. Flanking him like a Praetorian guard was a team of 4 high-powered corporate lawyers carrying thick leather briefcases. Directly behind them walked 2 stern, broad-shouldered men wearing tactical vests with federal financial fraud investigator badges prominently displayed across their chests. The atmosphere in the room shifted from chaotic panic to an icy, breathless terror. The crowd of furious investors immediately recognized Harrison. He was an apex predator in their world, a man who possessed enough capital to buy and sell every single person in that ballroom before breakfast. The sea of tailored suits and evening gowns parted for him instantly, clearing a wide, unobstructed path straight down the center aisle. Harrison walked with the slow, measured stride of an executioner. His silver eyes remained locked on the stage, completely ignoring the whispering crowd. He ascended the carpeted stairs with effortless grace. Richard, realizing the sheer magnitude of the incoming threat, scrambled backward, his aggressive posture collapsing into pathetic submission. Harrison stopped directly in front of me. The predatory smirk he had worn in Hector's garage was gone, replaced by a look of profound, calculating respect. I did not say a word. I simply held out the microphone. He took it from my hand, his gaze shifting slowly from me to the trembling, sweaty mess that was DeAndre. DeAndre looked like he was staring at the Grim Reaper. His knees literally buckled, sending him stumbling backward until he hit the velvet-draped podium. "Good evening," Harrison's voice rumbled through the speakers, deep and resonant, laced with raw corporate menace. "For those in the room who do not know me, my name is Harrison. I run a global holding company that specializes in high-risk acquisitions, and I am the primary financial backer of the man currently cowering behind that podium." Another collective gasp rippled through the audience. DeAndre's parents, who had barely recovered from the audio recording, buried their faces in their hands. Harrison paced slowly across the front of the stage, addressing the enraged investors sitting in the front rows. "My firm provided DeAndre with his initial seed capital," Harrison explained smoothly. "We gave him the leverage to enter the commercial sector. But instead of generating legitimate returns, he has been operating a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He has been using your investments to pay off my interest, all while completely failing to secure a single profitable asset. As of this morning, DeAndre owes my holding company exactly $50 million, and his final deadline to produce a viable asset to cover that deficit expired at noon today." The silence that followed was absolute. DeAndre was weeping silently now, his flashy suit ruined by sweat and terror. He knew there was no escape. The billionaire had personally come to collect, bringing the federal authorities with him to ensure the destruction was absolute. Harrison turned his back on the crowd and approached the velvet podium. He looked down at the forged transfer documents resting next to the silver fountain pen. He picked up the heavy legal paper, examining my father's fraudulent notary stamp with an expression of pure disgust. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You threw a very expensive party for nothing," DeAndre Harrison declared, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "Because Claire is not signing a single thing over to you tonight. She is not saving your fraudulent firm, and she is certainly not funding this ridiculous vanity project." Brittany let out a loud, pathetic wail from the floor, clutching her head as her entire fake reality disintegrated. You see, Harrison continued holding the forged document high in the air for the crowd to see. "Claire and I had a very productive business meeting yesterday afternoon. She possessed the legal deed to a highly coveted $25 million commercial plot in downtown Austin, a plot I very much wanted to acquire for a tech campus. But Claire is a preservationist at heart. She proved to be a much sharper negotiator than anyone in her miserable family." Harrison stepped back over to me, a glint of genuine admiration in his eyes. I watched my parents' faces contort in absolute horror as the billionaire laid out my ultimate victory. Instead of allowing this prime real estate to be swallowed by corporate greed or stolen by a desperate fraud, Harrison announced, Claire legally transferred the entire Austin property to the State Historical Conservation Trust. She utilized a specific legal mechanism that permanently shields the land from any commercial development or corporate buyout forever. It is untouchable. DeAndre let out a strangled, breathless sob. His golden parachute was gone. The land could never be developed. In exchange for orchestrating this massive donation to a conservation fund that my holding company proudly sponsors, Harrison concluded delivering the final, fatal blow to my family's sanity. Claire was heavily compensated. She received a direct, tax-free cash transfer of $15 million into a secure offshore account. Furthermore, I personally ensured that the vintage 1968 Mustang her sister stole from her was returned to her garage, untouched, this morning. My mother let out a shrill scream, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. $15 million. The amount echoed in her greedy mind, entirely out of her reach, entirely legally, secured by the daughter she had deemed a failure. Harrison looked at the forged transfer document in his hands one last time. He gripped the thick paper and ripped it straight down the middle, then ripped the halves again. He tossed the shredded pieces into the air, letting them flutter down onto DeAndre's expensive shoes like dirty confetti. "The documents on this stage are completely worthless," Harrison stated coldly, just like the man who presented them. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. The fire I had sparked in my ruined apartment had just consumed their entire world. Harrison stepped back, yielding the center of the stage to the two stern men wearing tactical vests. The logic of American corporate karma was about to strike with absolute devastating precision. The lead financial investigator stepped up to the velvet-draped podium, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from inside his jacket. He did not raise his voice, but the microphone caught his every word, broadcasting DeAndre's impending doom to the silent, breathless ballroom. DeAndre Washington, the investigator, stated, his tone clinically detached and utterly devoid of mercy. "We are serving you with immediate federal subpoenas for multiple counts of corporate fraud, wire fraud, and the gross embezzlement of investor capital. We have secured emergency warrants to freeze every single personal and business account tied to your name, including all offshore shell corporations you created to hide these funds." DeAndre let out a pathetic, guttural whimper. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting toward the exits, but the sheer volume of furious investors and hotel security personnel completely blocked any hope of escape. He was a rat, backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. Harrison stepped forward again, towering over the broken real estate broker. "As the primary stakeholder of your parent company," Harrison declared, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a sharpened scythe, "I am officially terminating your position, effective immediately. You are stripped of all executive authority. Furthermore, my legal team has already filed the necessary injunctions to trigger the immediate total foreclosure of your firm. Your corporate empire is dead, DeAndre. My people are currently changing the locks on your office doors and seizing your servers. Every hard drive, every fraudulent contract, and every falsified bank statement is being boxed up as federal evidence. You own absolutely nothing." The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of frantic action. The wealthy investors in the front rows, the powerful men who had been sipping champagne and laughing just moments ago, were now shouting furiously into their phones. They were scrambling to call their banks, their asset managers, and their lawyers, desperately trying to salvage whatever capital they could from the wreckage of DeAndre's massive scam. The illusion of high society elegance was completely shattered, replaced by the ugly, chaotic reality of financial survival. Men who previously exchanged polite pleasantries were now shoving past each other to reach the exit. But the demolition of their fake world was not over yet. As the corporate bloodbath unfolded, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom opened once more. Two local police officers in full uniform marched down the center aisle. They moved with brisk, unyielding authority, ignoring the panicking socialites parting like the Red Sea before them. I had instructed my legal team to coordinate with the local authorities hours in advance, providing them with the forged bill of sale, the false power of attorney, and the high-definition security footage from Hector's garage. The officers ascended the stage stairs, their heavy utility belts and radios clinking sharply against the silence that briefly fell over the immediate area. They completely bypassed the weeping DeAndre and walked directly toward my father and my sister. Richard stepped backward, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He held up his hands instinctively, trying to project his usual corporate dominance. "Officers, there is a terrible misunderstanding here," Richard stammered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling croak. "I am a respected notary. I am a senior executive in this city. We are dealing with a private family dispute over shared property." The lead officer did not even blink. He reached directly for the metal handcuffs resting at his belt. Richard Vance, you are under arrest for felony forgery, fraudulent use of a notary seal, and conspiracy to commit grand theft auto. At the exact same time, the second officer stepped toward Brittany, who was still curled on the stage floor, staring at her shattered phone. Brittany Vance, you are under arrest for felony grand theft auto. Brittany shrieked, scrambling backward away from the advancing officer. It was just an old car, she screamed, pointing a violently trembling finger at me. Claire is making a huge deal out of nothing. It was barely worth $45,000. I needed the money for my wedding. The officer grabbed Brittany by the arm and hauled her to her feet with practiced, ungentle efficiency. Actually, ma'am, the officer stated, loudly enough for the entire front row to hear. We received the official appraisal from a certified classic car expert this afternoon. The 1968 Ford Mustang you stole and illegally fenced is valued at over $250,000. That elevates this crime from a standard theft to a major high-level felony. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The metallic heavy click of handcuffs snapping shut around Richard's wrists echoed across the stage with a sharp, undeniable finality. My father, the man who had spent his entire life obsessing over public image and social superiority, was now standing on a brightly lit stage in a five-star hotel, wearing steel bracelets. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked exactly like a prison uniform. He stared down at his bound hands in absolute uncomprehending shock, his entire identity dissolving in an instant. A second sharp click rang out as the other officer cuffed Brittany's wrists tightly behind her back. The physical reality of the rigid metal restraints finally shattered her absolute delusion. Brittany dropped heavily to her knees on the hardwood stage. She tilted her head back and unleashed a raw, ear-piercing wail of pure agony. The heavy $50,000 borrowed diamond necklace she wore caught the brilliant light of the chandeliers, sparkling mockingly against her heaving chest. She sobbed uncontrollably, mascara running down her face in thick black streaks ruining her flawless influencer aesthetic forever. She was not a glamorous bride jetting off to Dubai to be worshipped by fans. She was a common criminal going to a cold concrete holding cell. Below the stage, Susan completely lost her mind. The perfectly composed, snobbish matriarch snapped entirely. She scrambled up the stairs and threw herself at the police officers, screaming hysterically. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, grabbing the lead officer's uniform shirt desperately, trying to pull his arm away from her husband. "Do you know who we are? We are prominent citizens. You are ruining our reputation. Stop it right now!" The officer easily swatted Susan's hands away and pointed a stern warning finger directly at her face. "Ma'am, step back immediately, or you will be joining your husband and daughter in the back of a squad car for assaulting a police officer. Do not interfere with a lawful arrest." Susan froze, terrified by the very real threat of jail time. She collapsed onto the edge of the stage, burying her face in her hands, weeping with loud, ugly, gasping sobs. She was completely broken, mourning the total, irreversible loss of her country club status. To the right of the stage, DeAndre's parents had seen enough. The illusion of their son's genius was dead. The wealthy empire they had been boasting about just an hour ago was revealed as a massive federal crime. They did not rush the stage to comfort their son. They did not offer to call lawyers or offer emotional support. Instead, they turned their backs on the scene entirely. Faces burning with absolute profound disgrace, they marched quickly and silently down the center aisle, pushing past the frantic investors and fleeing the ballroom. They abandoned their son to the federal authorities without a single backward glance, completely terrified of being implicated in his massive fraud. I stepped back to the very edge of the stage, removing myself from the epicenter of the chaos. The air around me felt incredibly clear and cool. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, my navy gown untouched by the sweat, tears, and dirt covering my family. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering guilt. I watched the federal investigators corner DeAndre. I watched the local police officers physically drag my father and my sister across the stage, marching them in handcuffs past the very high society elite they had worshipped. I watched my mother weeping on the floor, completely abandoned and ruined. The rot that had infected my entire life, the toxic, manipulative darkness that had tried to consume my grandfather's legacy and destroy my mental health, was finally being excised. I stood there utterly calm and watched my world become clean. I stood there, utterly calm, and watched my world become clean. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers pulsed through the tall glass windows of the St. Regis Hotel, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers like a fractured kaleidoscope. The frantic screaming eventually faded into the distance, replaced by the hushed, terrified whispers of the remaining high society guests who had just witnessed the absolute destruction of the Vance family legacy. I did not stay to answer their intrusive questions or bask in their shocked stares. I simply picked up my leather tote bag, adjusted my navy gown, and walked out the front doors into the cool, crisp night air. I left them all behind to drown in the devastating consequences of their own making. 1 month later, the air felt entirely different. It tasted like salt, absolute freedom, and unfiltered sunlight. I shifted the heavy polished chrome gearshift of the 1968 Ford Mustang, listening to the deep, satisfying roar of the classic V8 engine as I accelerated down the sun-drenched coastal highway. The cherry red paint, meticulously detailed and permanently protected by Hector's expert hands, gleamed brilliantly under the cloudless blue sky. I rolled the windows down, letting the strong ocean wind whip fiercely through my hair. The heavy vintage steering wheel felt solid and securely grounded in my grip. For the first time in my 33 years of life, I was in absolute control of my own direction. There were no more manipulative voices telling me I was a boring disappointment. There were no more golden children demanding my hard-earned resources to fund their ridiculous delusions. There was only the wide-open road ahead and the profound, unshakable security of the massive legacy my grandfather had truly left me. The fallout from the pre-wedding gala had been swift, merciless, and completely public. The federal authorities did not offer an ounce of leniency to a man who had defrauded powerful investors out of $50 million. DeAndre was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility. Denied bail as a major flight risk, he was facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison for extensive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. His flashy real estate firm was entirely liquidated within days, the remaining assets legally seized by Harrison's holding company to cover the massive deficit. DeAndre's parents, who had boasted so loudly and arrogantly about their son's genius, lost absolutely everything. Their own personal assets had been dangerously intertwined with his fraudulent shell companies. Their luxury cars were abruptly repossessed, their extravagant properties were foreclosed by the banks, and they were cast out of their elite social circles in absolute, irreversible disgrace. My own blood relatives fared no better under the crushing, unforgiving weight of the justice system. The local district attorney was highly motivated by the clear, high-definition video evidence of their forgery and the Grand Theft Auto incident. Facing airtight felony charges, Richard and Brittany were forced into humiliating plea deals to avoid serving actual prison time. They pled guilty, permanently branding my once proud father a convicted felon. The conviction immediately stripped him of his corporate notary license and destroyed his lucrative executive career. The exorbitant legal retainers required to keep them both out of a jail cell completely bankrupted my parents. The pristine Beacon Hill mansion, the pristine fortress where they had spent decades cultivating their toxic superiority, was seized and sold at public auction to cover their mounting debts and severe legal penalties. Susan was forced to move her family into a tiny, cramped rental apartment, entirely stripped of the country club status she valued more than the well-being of her own daughter. As for Brittany, the lavish Dubai wedding was permanently canceled. The extravagant venue deposits she had bragged about online were seized as criminal evidence during the fraud investigation. Without my parents' bottomless financial backing, and with her reputation entirely radioactive in the influencer community, her fake lifestyle collapsed overnight. The $50,000 diamond necklace she wore to the gala was confiscated right off her neck by the police as stolen goods. Today, my former golden child sister is working a grueling minimum wage retail job just to make the minimum monthly payments on her suffocating credit card debt. She is folding shirts in a mall, utterly exiled from social media, too disgraced and humiliated to ever post a single photo online again. The grand illusion she sacrificed her family to maintain had completely evaporated, leaving her alone with the stark, ugly reality of her own terrible choices. I eased the Mustang onto the shoulder of the highway, pulling over into a scenic outlook that offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the crashing ocean waves. I turned the ignition off, letting the powerful engine rumble down into total silence. The rhythmic, soothing sound of the surf crashing against the jagged coastal rocks filled the quiet cabin. I stepped out of the classic car and walked toward the weathered wooden guardrail, leaning heavily against it as I stared out at the infinite, glittering horizon. The warm sun beat down on my shoulders, a stark, beautiful contrast to the cold, suffocating shadows of my parents' house. I thought about my mother's cruel words echoing in the ruined living room just a month ago. They called me boring. They mocked me for spending my life looking at old, broken things. But as an architectural conservator, I know a fundamental truth. You can only save a structure by stripping away the rot, no matter how much it hurts. I didn't lose my family. I demolished a toxic foundation to build a life of my own. Have you ever had to tear down a toxic family dynamic to save yourself or you? Has someone's greed ever pushed you to your absolute limit? Let me know your story in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful restorations require the hardest demolition. Hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. The story of Claire and her stolen 1968 Mustang offers a profound masterclass in recognizing and dismantling toxic family dynamics. The most crucial lesson woven throughout this saga is that true healing often requires absolute demolition. Society frequently conditions us to believe that family loyalty is an unbreakable contract, obligating us to endure manipulation, gaslighting, and even outright theft in the name of keeping the peace. However, Claire's journey demonstrates that peace purchased at the expense of your own dignity is nothing but a hostage situation. When her parents and sister colluded to steal her grandfather's legacy to fund a superficial facade, they relied on the assumption that she would remain the compliant, silent scapegoat. They mistook her quiet profession of preserving history for a weakness they could exploit. Yet the very skills Claire used to restore architectural foundations, identifying rot, assessing structural integrity, and excising the decay, became the exact tools she needed to save her own life. We learn that we are not obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. Sometimes, the people who share our DNA are the ones who are most willing to sell our future for their momentary vanity. Walking away from them does not make you a villain. It makes you a survivor. Rebuilding your life requires a solid foundation, and you cannot build a sturdy future on a bed of lies, forged signatures, and emotional blackmail. True empowerment comes when you stop trying to fix the people who are actively breaking you, and instead redirect that energy into building a sanctuary of your own. Never be afraid to swing the wrecking ball on relationships that offer nothing but ruin, because your peace is worth protecting. Share your own story of tearing down toxic foundations to rebuild your life in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe for more empowering content.